Want to know why? Ask how. Howard the Humongous. And it's our second episode of Beauty and the Brain. Here is the brain. I'm the beauty. Okay, this is Ivy Lothberg, and Ivy has been coming up with bizarre questions for me.
Yes.
Okay, over to you, Ivy.
Thank you. Well, I've been reading How I Accidentally Discovered the 60s.
Yeah, How I Accidentally Started the 60s.
Which is an incredible book.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I'm loving... One thing I really wanted to talk to you about is it's really the most entertaining memoir I've ever read. It's like
that's fantastic. That's wonderful to hear. Well, I tried to keep you amused.
You did.
And I was trying to achieve something transcendent amusement. And I was trying to achieve transcendent amusement because I was stuck in bed with an illness and for 15 years. And I was too weak to speak for 5 years. And I realized with all the research that I do, all the research points at a simple fact, that if you have a rich network of social contacts, it helps elevate your level of health and it helps give you sharper thinking, the perceptual level of your brain. And if you're stuck in a bed and stuck in a bedroom and you're not even allowed to have another person in the room, that's somewhat disruptive to your social contacts. In other words, you lose touch with everybody you've ever known. And I wanted to somehow reach out and develop, if I had to, totally new contacts. One way or the other, I needed friends. And I'd gone through the episodes in How I Accidentally Started the 60s and used to tell them orally like a troubadour on the road. And you could literally telling those stories, because they're amazing, they're almost unbelievable stories, and yet they all happened. So I used to be able to hold a female audience of one, for example, spellbound for 6 hours with those stories. So I decided to tell those stories in print. But when you're in really serious misery with a serious illness like that, you need something transcendent. You need something that will totally lift you out of your body and take you to a whole different level of imagination that will leave your body and its difficulties behind. And two people did that for me. One was P.G. Wodehouse, the comic novelist who wrote about Jeeves, the butler. And the other one, who's just unbelievable. This man is so soaringly, astonishingly funny that it utterly defies belief. And the other was Dave Barry, the great expert on comic writing of the 1980s and 1990s. So I wanted to achieve for other people what Dave Barry and P.G. Wodehouse had achieved for me. A humor that takes you so far out of your body that you're off in a wonderland. And, of course, I have a very different vocabulary, a very different vocabulary of words, a very different vocabulary of concepts than either of those guys. But the principle, I was motivated to try to do what they were doing, in part because I knew one of my colleagues in a group that I founded, the International Paleopsychology Project, he is the world's leading expert on large animal behavior. So he will disappear for 6 months in a year into the mountains with a knapsack and a rifle. And he will live off the land for the next 6 months following the mountain sheep and living like a mountain sheep. And then he'll come back and he'll write a book on mountain sheep and their behavior, and it wins an award. And then he does the same thing the next year and follows some other kind of big animal. And his name is Valerius Geist. And Valerius Geist has this wonderful book on evolutionary biology called Life Strategies, and he points out in Life Strategies that all forms of communication, whether they're communication between bacteria or communication between human beings, break down into two basic things: attraction cues and repulsion cues. Just like electrons and protons, which speak with attraction cues and repulsion cues. And I realized if I'm going to have anybody that will still communicate with me while I'm stuck in this room and can't have anybody in the room with me, I'm going to have to put out attraction cues. And we naturally, when we're sick, put out repulsion cues. We don't even know it. We're crabby and we act as if we want to be isolated, and that's not what we really want. We need other people to support us. But we put out cues that we want other people to go away. And what's an attraction cue? Well, if I tell people how sick I am, it's going to send them away. But if I tell them stories that have a humor that helps them just go far out of their normal sphere for an hour or 2 hours, whatever time they're reading it, then maybe I'll attract some people. So that's how that book came to be. And then this weird thing happened. I wanted, once the book was finished, I wanted to get it to some people associated with the 60s to see what they thought of it. And one of the people I thought of was the Jefferson Airplane. Now, admittedly, the Jefferson Airplane didn't begin to achieve success until 3 or 4 years after the key events in this book had taken place, because I really was accidentally helping start the 60s, and compared to what I had been accidentally doing, the Jefferson Airplane were latecomers. Nonetheless, I wanted to get their opinion, so I wrote. In those days, we had snail mail. Very few people. Peter Gabriel and I were on email, but almost nobody else on planet Earth. And so I wrote a letter to a friend who had gotten his start in the entertainment industry as a roadie for the Jefferson Airplane. And he got the letter and he said, well, actually, I have a better idea. There's another client that I'm working with who I think is more appropriate for this. His other client was Timothy Leary.
Wow.
A guy who helped put the 60s on the map, a guy who put LSD on the map as acid. Well, that sounded reasonable. So he got the book to Timothy, and a month later, I got this amazing quote that said that the book was a monumental masterpiece of American literature, that it was filled with wow, woo, and aha experiences, that it had nonstop waves of hilarity, that it was filled with scientific comedy routines and all kinds of amazing stuff, and compared the writing to James Joyce, of all people. And I didn't believe it came from Timothy. It was just too enthusiastic. So for years I didn't believe it came from Timothy Leary. And then a friend of mine, Douglas Rushkoff, came over, and he brought over a guy named something like Doug Cameron or something like that. He was an artist from San Francisco. And the two of them had spent the last 4 months of Timothy Leary's life with Timothy at his bedside. And I had a printer out in the bedroom. I was still sick in bed, and when they came over, their teeth were chattering because I had 2 indoor air conditioners that were keeping the temperature down to 68 degrees so that I could think, because this chronic fatigue syndrome, my illness, just screws up your whole thermoregulatory system. So they were sitting there in misery and grief, and I printed up 2 copies of this quote and handed it to them, at least to the best of my ability, laying there in the bed. They were at the foot of the bed, and they read it, and there was this very strange silence. Now, I knew exactly what was going on in that very strange silence. They didn't want to hurt my feelings, and they were trying to figure out how to tell me that this quote hadn't come from Timothy Leary, right, without hurting my feelings. When they opened their mouth, it turned out I was dead wrong, absolutely dead wrong. The reason they were so silent is because, well, you could hear it in their tone of voice. They said, "That's Tim." And you could see that they were brought back to that period of time when they were sitting with a dying friend. And so people asked me, when I finally put the book out in the last few months, and people asked me, how did you get a quote from Timothy Leary? He's been dead since 1996. And I wrote up what I could remember of how I got this quote from Timothy Leary. And then I sent what I'd written up to Douglas Rushkoff to fact check, to make sure I'd gotten it right. And it was only then, in the conversation with Doug, that I realized something. Timothy Leary, when he got this book, he would die within 4 months' time of prostate cancer. I hadn't known that. So here's one person trying to write absolutely transcendent humor that lifts you out of your bed from a bed in Brooklyn. And the person who receives the manuscript has been told he's got a terminal case of prostate cancer. And he needs something even more than I did to lift him out of his grief. And apparently the book did that for him. So that's why this tremendous book. And what's the key ingredient that achieves all of this? Humor. Humor to the nth degree. But humor has this strange property. When you're writing humor, you're actually writing truths in an entertainment in disguise as an entertainment. So that's how that book came to be, and how it came to be compared to the writings of James Joyce.
It's extraordinary.
Yeah, it was a neat story.
What I also was really struck by is a sense that you write a lot about the experiences that you had growing up as a kid,
right,
and the systematic bullying and social rejection,
right,
and the way that you write about it humorously, I found really transcendent.
Well, that's terrific.
And I really wanted to ask you about how you felt. Do you feel like that subject from your perspective of bullying? Do you feel like it's worse now? And do you feel like it's, how do you fit it into our social context now as opposed to then?
Well, bullying goes on in all kinds of animals, and it goes on among little animals because they're beginning to establish a dominance hierarchy. And those who bully their way to the top stay in a top position. Actually, the ones who bully their way to the top don't bully. They use lieutenants. They use others to bully on their behalf. And so this goes on in all kinds of animals and all kinds of human groups, and it was not recognized. People liked to think in the 1950s when I was growing up that children are these wonderful little creatures, that they, if there is such a thing as a noble savage on the face of the earth, people who are just filled with a generous spirit, which is then destroyed by modern industrial society, if there are such little angels, that those little angels are children. And the view of children as little angels was so pervasive that adults didn't seem to notice just how monstrous children can be. And because there was no research being done on this at the time, in the 50s and the 60s, it's impossible to say that there's any more bullying today. The one thing that it is possible to say is that bullying had not made it as a serious adult subject for adults in the 1950s and 1960s. It wasn't until the novel Lord of the Flies came out, and it was about the savagery and violence of children.
Yeah.
And children are very cruel, or they can be extraordinarily cruel. And it wasn't until then that bullying began to surface in adult conversation. And it isn't really until the last 5 or 6 years that bullying has become a major topic of adult conversation. So we know that bullying's become an increased topic of adult conversation, but does the real bullying that goes on generation after generation among kids, is it any worse than it was back then? It's impossible to say because nobody's done the research.
Do you see that changing with all of the awareness about bullying and all the conversations about bullying? Do you see that changing in schools and dealing with kind of the heart of where that bullying is coming from?
It would be extremely nice if we could invent educational systems that would get the bullying out of kids, that would stop them from bullying, that would get them to police each other to keep from bullying without using bullying as an excuse to bully, or anti-bullying campaigns as an excuse for new bullies to establish their dominance. But I'm not sufficiently familiar with what's going on in the educational world to know if that's possible. And one way or the other, Ron, what's his name, the guy who's now the mayor of Chicago, who used to be chief of staff for Obama, Rahm Emanuel. So Rahm Emanuel says, never let a good catastrophe go to waste, or something of the sort. And in the book, what's obvious is that I gained tremendously from being made an outcast in my hometown. I gained tremendously from all of that bullying. I would not have the privileged outsider status, outside of everything, never accepted within anything, that I've had for the last 65 years, if it weren't for the fact that I was made an outcast and I had no other option in Buffalo, New York. So, every disaster is an opportunity waiting for its positives to be discovered.
Fantastic.
And the other thing is, I strongly suspect that it's the kids who make it to the alpha position, the kids who become the leaders, don't bully because they have lieutenants. So the kid who ran a group called the Hartwell Gang, I lived on this little one-block street called Hartwell Road, and in Buffalo, New York. And the kid who ran the group that used to humiliate me and chase me around the block and beat me up and all kinds of things, when I was 8 years old, he's a natural-born lieutenant, a natural-born enforcer. And apparently enforcers need leaders that they can bolster. And so what happened when I was 8 years old? Well, the local Jewish center had a stamp club. I became interested in collecting stamps. I was ferociously interested in it. And though I hate to admit that I ever did something so boring with variety, but at any rate, so he had me enter the Jewish Center Stamp Club, and then he organized, I didn't ask him to do this, he organized a clique to vote for me as president. And so I was the leader coming from one clique, and then there was another leader coming from another clique. And just to enforce the position that I was going to be president, not the other guy, Bruce Follett, my former bully, he bloodied the nose of the leader of the other clique, and I was elected president of the Stamp Club, my very first leadership position. Because apparently, the way things shake out, the enforcers need a leader on whose behalf to enforce. So Bruce had made me the leader, and he's treated me as a leader ever since. We're still friends all these years later. So who am I friends with from Hartwell Road? Not any of the kids I was friends with back then. The bully who used to lead the gang that used to beat me up.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Oh. Well, the other things that I was really interested in reading the book was in the nature of reality. And in the 60s, we were questioning the nature of reality.
We sure were.
And now we have reality television.
Right.
Which is someone in the media saying, this is what reality is.
And it's false. And because they deliberately in reality television set up antagonisms, they set up battles, they set up situations like Survivor where somebody's going to be humiliated and thrown out of the group. They set up bullying. They set up conflict. Does conflict really take place in that form in normal life? Well, you can make that kind of conflict happen, and presumably that's because it does exist somewhere. But it's an artificial conflict that's set up by the people who formulate the shows. So we're not seeing reality on reality television. We're seeing a peculiar corner of misshapen reality that's been crowded into a certain form, the way that you herd sheep when you have two sheepdogs and a guy on a horse or something like that. People, I guess, shepherds don't ride horses, but you have a human and a couple of animals. That herd shape is not necessarily the natural shape of a herd, but it reflects the natural shape of a herd, and it's based on the natural instincts of the sheep. So what we're seeing on reality television is what you can create with the real tools of human nature that we've got.
And why do you think that that's become something that's appeared now in culture?
Well, because we love to watch conflict. We love to watch competition. We love to watch it as people try to create a dominance hierarchy. In my first book, The Lucifer Principle, there's a story of a whole bunch of research on juvenile gangs in Chicago and summer camps. And the research tends to indicate that every group has a certain predetermined structure. And it has an alpha, a leader, and it has a second in command who's a lieutenant, and it has a third under the leader who's the joker, and it has a nerd that everybody agrees you can all beat up on. And they track that basic structure, the researchers who were researching this, track that basic structure in adult mafia gangs and all kinds of social groups. And but to establish a group like that takes conflict and competition. Nobody's automatically made the alpha in most cases, or the two guys under the alpha. So, and one of the most interesting experiments, and this has been done in ants and all kinds of creatures, you take just alphas, just leaders, and you take a bunch of leaders from separate groups, 7 or 8 of them, and you put them together in a group. And you would think, well, they're all alphas, right? No, the minute they're in a group together, they once again sort themselves out. So there is one alpha, one joker, one lieutenant, one nerd at the very bottom. And the nerd is a former alpha, for God's sakes.
Wow.
So this kind of inherent group structure that we struggle for, whether we're lizards, because lizards get into dominance showdowns, and in the dominant showdown, one lizard comes out on top. This is built into us, and it's not. Presumably, it's not just built in. It's not an artifact of industrial society. It's not an artifact of post-agricultural society. It's not an artifact of patriarchal society, and it exists among women. And women are very cruel and vicious in establishing their dominance hierarchies, far more vicious than are men. Men have a greater orientation toward physical violence, women have this intense orientation toward humiliating and torturing each other in order to establish their dominance hierarchies. So these dominance hierarchies are all over the place. And the Lucifer Principle and Global Brain, my first two books, have everything in the world to do with how nations establish dominance hierarchies between them. Right now, America is the alpha. And of all people, the people trying hardest to tear us down and get us out of the alpha position are Americans. And how societies like Britain and France are in sort of the beta position. France has taken very enthusiastically to the lieutenant role, the enforcer role. So it's been sending troops into Mali and places like that that we have not dared to send our troops into. And you see it all over the place. But the remarkable thing, and it wasn't until after I'd written the Lucifer Principle and Global Brain that I realized this. You see the beginning of hierarchy of all things in inanimate things among stars. You have a Big Bang, and this unfurling sheet of space and time comes rip-roaring out at astonishing speed. It rapidly precipitates into the very first things, quarks. The quarks get together in groups of three, and some groups of three that look sort of like this, become protons, and groups of three that look like this become neutrons. And once the protons and neutrons form, well, initially everything's moving at such high speed that you've got all of these particles colliding up against each other and bouncing off like bullets colliding head-on, but colliding much faster. That goes on for 300,000 years, and then the universe cools down. Cool means moving at a slower speed. And once they move at a slower speed, there have been electrons in this the whole time, and the electrons and the atoms get together and they form, or the electrons and the protons get together and they form atoms. Well, once the atoms are formed, then all of a sudden these atoms discover something they've never known before. They're attracted by this little silent whispering force of gravity. And once they start to accumulate gravitationally, they accumulate as wisps of gas and as wisps of dust. And that's when the competition begins. Because if you're a wisp of gas and you're bigger than I am, and I'm a wisp of gas, we go up against each other as if we're having a showdown. You're bigger than I am, you win, you swallow me whole. I become a part of you. So that kind of gravitational competition goes on until finally we have these great big dust bunnies called galaxies. And then within the galaxies, there's competition between gravity balls. By now, things have grown bigger and bigger and bigger, with the winner always swallowing the losers. And some of these balls become so big that the internal pressure, the gravitational pressure, starts ripping apart the atoms at their heart. And the screams of these dying atomic nuclei are photons, they're light. So the light of these gravity balls, we call those gravity balls stars. And the light of those gravity balls is basically the scream of dying atomic nuclei at the heart of these things. And basically, some other gravity balls work out a deal with these giant ignited gravity balls, the stars. And the deal is, I'll stay at just a certain distance from you and move at just the right speed to stay out of your reach. You won't swallow me, but I'll work around you, and you're the leader. You get to determine where we go. I will follow you wherever we go. Those things that work out this subservient role with the stars, that work out a compromise with the stars, they're called planets. And then there are other gravity balls that work out a deal with the planets, because the planets are forming by swallowing every competing glump of gravitational matter they can find, just swallowing them. And certain gravity balls, smaller gravity balls, work out the same deal with the planets that the planets worked out with the sun. That is, okay, I'll circle you at a certain distance. I'll keep my distance, but I'll circle at the right speed, and you won't swallow me. Okay, and those are called moons. And we've discovered something like 300 moons around. I'm not sure whether it was Jupiter or Saturn, and plus all those little objects that you see in Saturn's rings, gazillions of them. I mean, millions and upon millions of them. They've all worked out this kind of a compromise. So what does that mean for hierarchical structures among human beings? What does it mean for pecking orders among human beings? Even stars, planets, and moons have a pecking order. But you could say, Bloom, this is wretched anthropomorphism, and we're not allowed anthropomorphism in science. There's no hierarchy. How can you say that a sun is in any way dominant over the planets that circle around it? Well, he who has control is dominant. And a sun, because of its gravitational mass and because it pulls the gravity of all of the things surrounding it, the moons and planets, it encompasses that within its own gravitational sphere. But it's the sun that determines where we go. It's the sun that determines our motion. And that's control. That's what we would call, in human terms, leadership. So hierarchical structures and pecking orders, the primitive seeds of that started even before life began. And you'll see it in lobsters and lizards and puppies and, the games that puppies play. Those are dominance games. Those are bullying games. One puppy comes out on top and stands there very proudly, very proud of the fact that at the end of the game he's still standing, and another puppy is rolled over on its back. Well, rolling over on your back is what's called a submission gesture. And standing straight at the end of a fight like that, even though it's a playful looking fight and it's all fuzzy and cute, still standing up straight, that's a dominance gesture. Where do dominance gestures and submission gestures come into play? In the establishment of hierarchies, in the establishment of pecking orders. So the pecking order is just a primary process in this universe, a primary building tool, a brick with which the universe builds herself up to higher and higher levels.
And how do you see those principles related to the ideas that you were stumbling on in the 60s and of free love and opening up to being love and beauty?
Well, I was seeking adventure. I was seeking things that are outside the bounds of normal middle class experience. And so these things are not dominant. Pecking order things are not dominant at all in how I suddenly started the 60s. But there is this moment where I'm in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is a city of stone, and there are very few trees, very few plants. At least there were very few in 1962 and 1963 when I was in Israel. And it would be a Friday night, and I would be walking down these stone streets with stone buildings on either side, and the moon would be in the sky above me, and stars, and I felt so lonely, and I was in such intense pain because of my isolation that it was ridiculous. And I heard people, because it was Friday night, and Friday night traditional Jewish families welcome in the Queen of the Sabbath, and they sing songs, and they have a wonderful, wonderful time together. And I could hear these families inside singing songs, and I could see the light from their windows was spilling out onto the stone street where I was walking. And it made me feel even more isolated. And one thing just kept going through my mind, and that was a phrase from Jesus of Nazareth, a phrase from what are called the Synoptic Gospels, the first 4 Gospels to be written, and especially it's in Matthew, I think. And it is, "To he who hath it shall be given, from he who hath not, even what he hath shall be taken away." And in other words, if you've got something and other people are attracted to you, even more people are going to be attracted to you. If you've got nothing and other people are repelled by you, even more people are going to be repelled by you. If you're poor, you would think money should go to the poor, right? No, the poor are giving off repulsion cues, and other people stay away from them. It's the rich people take presents to, the people who don't need it. So this is a principle that began to become very clear to me, because when you're very depressed, nobody wants to have anything to do with you. It takes having a certain amount of joy before people are attracted to you. Well, you would think other people would come around you when you're depressed in order to lift you out of your misery. That's not the way it works. You have to lift yourself out of your misery before other people will be attracted to you. It was phrased not only in the book of Matthew, in the New Testament, it was also phrased in a blues song. And the blues song is, "Nobody loves you when you're down and out." When you run out of money, your friends flee from you. When you get your hands on $1 again, everybody wants to be your long lost friend. That's the line from Nobody Loves You When You're Down and Out. And it's true. And since then, I've been able to trace this principle at work at every level of biology. The brain is like that. You're born with twice as many brain cells as you will need in adulthood. And each brain cell, each neuron, is built with a little self-destruct mechanism, a suicide mechanism. And so each brain cell has to determine for itself whether it's going to live or die. And how does it determine whether it's going to live? The more connections, eager connections it gets from other brain cells, the more enthusiastic other brain cells are about connecting to it, the healthier, more robust it's going to be.
Wow.
But if it doesn't get connections from other brain cells, it mopes, it gets depressed, and it kills itself off. It just says yes to its internal suicide mechanism. It's called an apoptotic mechanism. And so that works at the level of brain cells, and it works at the level of bacterial colonies, and it works at the level of red grouse on the moors of Scotland, and certainly the level of human beings. You can see it in your own depressions and elations, and your own social ups and downs from day to day and year to year. So that was the one basic principle that became important to the complex of principles in the Lucifer principle. The Lucifer principle, there's a triad of elements in the Lucifer principle. It's a trinity, the holy trinity of biology and nature. And it's superorganisms. In other words, when we all come together, you and I and Mark and all the people that we're talking to and all the people who won't ever listen to this, we're a collective brain. I mean, our brain is a collective process. It's got 100 billion cells all working together, determining whether they should live or die and doing a great many other things. And you and I are like individual cells in a larger collective brain, and that larger thing is the superorganism. So it's superorganisms pecking order, because superorganisms establish pecking orders, and some of them become dominant, and some of them become submissive and work out a deal with the dominant ones, and some of them do away with themselves altogether. And the third element, so we've got superorganism, we've got pecking orders, and the third element is ideas, memes, that ideas actually use us, that ideas use us to procreate. And some ideas do incredibly well and take over the earth. Islam has done that among 1.8 billion people. Christianity has done that over about 1.2 billion people. Modern secular scientism, my religion, has done that with probably 4 of the 6-7 billion people on the face of the planet so far. And you see that when pop songs are competing. You know, if you were a musical artist and you put out a song and you were hoping it would be a big hit, the odds are 1,000,000 to 1 against anybody ever hearing it. You're in a heavy-duty competition. But some songs, like, oh God, what was that wretched one about, I'm going to give you my number or something like that. But some songs just become ubiquitous. They take off all over the place because they're in the kind of dominance hierarchy competition that everything else is in this cosmos. And ideas use the soup of human brains in which to nourish themselves. So when you hear a song that you just loathe, and yet it keeps going through your brain for the next year, popping up at all kinds of strange times, and you wish you could get out of there, that idea is doing a very successful job of using you to stay alive. And at the same time, it's using hundreds of millions of other people to stay alive. And there are certain ideas, worldviews, pictures of the invisible world that take over. What do I mean by pictures of the invisible world? Well, you do your best to avoid having too high a level of cholesterol, right? Because you're told that will give you heart attacks if it's too high. Have you ever seen cholesterol?
I haven't.
No, and neither have I. And I've spent my whole life in science, at least since I was 10 years old. And so that's a picture of an invisible world that cholesterol is referring to. It's a belief system that alleges to be about the real world, but we have not personally had the privilege of witnessing it. So for us, it's a picture of the invisible world. And it's pictures of the invisible world that are particularly successful in taking over brains. Islam has one picture of the invisible world. Christianity has another picture of the invisible world. Modern scientific secularism has another picture of the invisible world. And in America, we have a problem because we think our picture of the invisible world is universal. that it's the default mode, that everybody really wants it, that everybody actually reasons according to our assumptions about what the physical world, what the invisible world is all about. And what we don't realize is, no, that's not true at all. Other people work on radically different assumptions about the nature of the invisible world, and as a consequence, what's rational, logical, and idealistic for them is very different from what's rational and realistic for us, and that's why the Sochi bombers, for example, the people out to bomb the Sochi Olympics that takes place in a couple of days. That's why those people aren't insane. Osama bin Laden was not insane. They're simply operating off a different picture of the invisible world and with different assumptions. And when you do that, the things that you do in the name of logic and idealism are radically different. These people are doing a favor to humanity as far as they're concerned. They're trying to bring the only truth in the world to their fellow human beings. And it's obvious that God made this world and God made you and me. So if God made a set of laws, that's the set of laws that humans should adhere to. Otherwise, they're going to go to hell. And heaven and hell are forever. Life here on earth is very, very short. And if you kill yourself trying to kill non-believers so that you can liberate all of those people who are in darkness, Jahiliyyah it's called, idolatry. So if you try to liberate all those people who are in darkness, you're going to save their souls for heaven. They're going to thank you because you're giving them an eternity in heaven rather than an eternity in hell. And plus you get an express ticket to paradise if you kill non-believers and killing yourself. That's instant paradise. And if life on earth is a very short and painful trial, but if life in heaven or hell is forever, then obviously you have to reason in terms of heaven or hell, and hell, not in terms of the visible things we see on this planet. Well, you could say, but heaven or hell, have you ever seen heaven or hell? These are ideas, they're fantasies, they're not realities. Well, have you ever seen cholesterol? That's just as much a fantasy. So the concepts of the invisible world, of worldviews, of how worldviews as ideas manage to take over masses of human brains and become part of the forces of history, along with the hierarchical battle between social groups, including subcultures within a culture, and including overcultures like America, France, Saudi Arabia, etc., Iran. All of this is in the Lucifer Principle, my first book. And the second book, Global Brain, is more about how we all function as a collective intelligence, and not just we humans functioning as a collective intelligence. Bacteria who've been around, who are our ancestors, who've been around for almost 4 billion years on the face of this planet, they participate in the process of this global braining, this collective intelligence. Plants participate in it, animals participate in it. We get an awful lot more from plants and animals in the way of an intelligence than we realize. And global brain focuses more on the battle between subcultures within a culture to become the eyes and ears, the pilot. It's like on a ship where, you've got the wheel and windows and you can look out and you steer the thing. The subculture that comes out as the alpha subculture ends up taking over the pilot role and becomes the eyes and ears of the society. Like a star, it determines where we all go. And we all follow along. So those are the ideas some of the ideas in the first two books, but they're not really in How I Accidentally Started the 60s, because How I Accidentally Started the 60s is about adventuring and having very bizarre experiences with your fellow human beings in order to find out what the limits of humanity are. And in order to really gain enlightenment, to be able to expand. Hermann Hesse says we have 10,000 personalities hidden in the closet of the soul, and that we have empathically the ability to feel what it's like to feel the experience of every other kind of human on the planet. And How I Accidentally Started the 60s is about exercising those 10,000 people in the soul by having weird, strange, bizarre, unlikely adventures. And the goal is to achieve basically the ability to hold infinity in the palm of your hand, to see the infinite, the tiniest of things, which Edna St. Vincent Millay, in a poem that I ran across when I was 16 years old, said you have to expand that empathic self to encompass every bizarre part of human experience if you're going to see the infinite in the tiniest of things. And I think Edna St. Vincent Millay was right, even though she was writing a piece of poetry.
Beautiful. Amazing.
Yeah.
And how do you feel like that when you relating that to the hierarchy principles of how do you see those related to each other?
Well, in How Accidentally, remember, I was excluded my whole childhood from being part of normal society. So what role am I taking on in How I Accidentally Started the 60s? An outsider, a total outsider, a person who steps in for a minute. I'm picked up by 3 murderers in Eugene, Oregon. And they're going to take me all the way to San Francisco, which is roughly a 7-hour drive. And they try to scare the shit out of me by telling me the stories of every murder they've ever committed, every savage torture deed in which they've tortured their fellow human beings. And that goes on for about 2 hours. And then, when they run out of that subject, they try to impress me with their machismo by discussing all the women who've ever given them oral sex. And discussing the mouthing techniques and what these women do with their tongue. I mean, it's a field at that point, I've had almost no sex ever in my life, and have certainly never experienced oral sex. And they're talking about things that are so far beyond me, it's ridiculous. And then after 2 hours of that, they run out of that to talk about. And then they focus on me, and they suddenly, I mean, I'm barefoot. I have this long hair of a kind no one's ever seen on a human being before. If you see the cover photo from How I Accidentally Started the 60s, you've never seen hair like that, ever. And it was 1962, and everybody had worn crew cuts. Men wore haircuts that were only 2 inches long. So nobody's seen anything like this, ever. And so I'm looking rather strange. And they turn to me, and they come to the conclusion that I'm living a life without purpose and meaning. And so for the next 2 hours, they lecture me on how you need goals in your life, how you need structure in your life, how you need a woman in your life. Well, you guys have just told me all these amazing tales about all the women that you're cheating on the women in your lives with, and now you're talking to me about making a commitment to a woman in your life. This is crazy. But the amazing thing is, I'm able to, through the privileges that Jack Kerouac gave us, to go out and adventure and be on the road. This gives me 6 hours of insight into a whole society I'd never see, a whole subculture I would never, ever see normally. And so it gives me a 6-hour taste, and a very intense one. And it tells me that within their subculture, no matter how many people they like to murder, no matter how many people they like to chain in a basement without food or water to a bed and watch them suffer, there's something profoundly decent in these people. They genuinely want to save my life. They genuinely want to redeem me in some way. And so in this book, you step into subcultures briefly, and then you step out of them again, and then you step into other ones, and then you step out of those again. And that's what adventure really is all about. But again, the whole point is to tell you these stories with humor that's sublime, that just yanks you out of yourself completely.
And I also found with that, I think this profound thing about telling stories that are nonfiction in that transcendent, joyful space.
Right.
As I was reading it, I found it very therapeutic, because if you look at your life from this epic adventure, it helps to recontextualize what you're experiencing and not take it so personally, and really have a bigger picture of what the adventure of your life can offer.
Well, when I started doing radio interviews about this book, and I've done I don't know, a dozen of them, 15 of them, something like that, and I had to go back to read the book again because it had been a long time, and you forget what's in your books because you're always moving on to the next one. I was amazed. I was amazed because there were so many really profound truths in there that go way beyond the context of just one book. And which is why I think that humor provides us with a way to pronounce truths that we wouldn't have in other contexts. And so I'm amazed to see that romantic relationships in this book are not at all what we're told romantic relationships are about when we're 11 years old and we start reading romance comic books. And then we move on to romantic novels and cute little romantic films and stuff like that. No, I'm sorry, that's not the way things go. That has very little to do with the motivations that bring a man and a woman together. Yeah, I mean, Edna St. Vincent Millay basically told me, go in strange ways through her poetry, go out and have these epic adventures. And then you will be able to see things in a far greater way. And she was right. And there's another thing. If you are thrown to the outskirts of a society, if you're an animal, like say a gazelle, and the primary animals, the alphas and the betas, the leaders and their lieutenants, get to stay at the center of the herd. You, if you're the sheep at the very bottom of the pile, or you're the gazelle at the very bottom of the pile, you have to stay on the outskirts. Well, if a wolf pack comes along and wants to pick one of you off, who's in the greatest danger? The people, the sheep, or the gazelles on the outskirts, or the gazelles at the very center? Well, the gazelles at the very center are remarkably safe because they're insulated by all of these layers of lesser gazelles. And if you're on the very outside, well, you're in the most vulnerable place imaginable. But that makes you, as part of a collective brain, because even gazelles operate with a collective brain, it makes you a watcher. It makes you one of those who is the first to see a danger. And it puts you in a position where your job is to stay as alert as hell to the outside world while the others enjoy their cozy little interior world. And that's the position I was shoved into when I was a child, as a watcher, to keep my eyes and ears open and bring to you on the inside the vision of what's of what's happening out there. That's startling and strange. And that's what adventure is all about. Stepping outside the bounds of comfort. Nobody's there to protect you at all. When a gang of 5 people, 5 guys looking very, very tough stops and tells you that first they're going to gang rape you because of the way you're wearing your hair, that first they're going to gang rape you, and after they've gang raped you, they're going to tie you to the rear bumper of their car, and they're going to drag you to the nearest barber shop, and they're going to stand there as your hair is cut. When a bunch of guys tell you that, it's just you and them. There's nobody there to protect you. Not at all. Now, in my case, I turn out, who knew, but I turn out to be very, very good at talking muggers out of mugging me and talking rapists out of raping me and all kinds of stuff. So I never was, I was threatened with these kinds of rapes several times, but nobody's ever raped me, thank God.
Thank God.
Yeah, yes. Right. But you're on your own out there. You're in a very precarious and dangerous position. But what is adventure about? Adventure is about risk. Adventure is about taking on situations that could kill you and triumphing over them. And T.S. Eliot, in another poem that I ran across when I was 16 years old, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, says that if you have heroic adventures in you that you think will define you, that you think will get girls to pay serious attention to you, because that's always the bottom line measurement of things, start them now. Or someday, if you put them off until next year, and then the year after that, and then the year after that, someday you'll wake up and realize that your life energy has been spent. You no longer have the energy or the time to make any of these adventures come true. So T.S. Eliot was telling me, go out and live a life of epic adventure, which I've pretty much done for 60 years.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, very far beyond the bounds of just how I accidentally started the 60s.
Yeah.
With nosediving into a field I knew nothing about, the rock and roll business, with working with Michael Jackson and Prince and Bob Marley and Bette Midler and AC/DC and Aerosmith and Kiss and Queen and Billy Joel and Billy Idol and Paul Simon and all kinds of people like that.
Yeah.
And then with diving back into my science and discovering that there was something called group selection, and it was considered absolutely laughable to support it in any way, and I realized my work needed group selection to be taken seriously, or my work wouldn't be taken seriously. And going out and battling and being told by the leading person in group selection, David Sloan Wilson, stop this immediately, you're destroying everything I've worked for in my career. And having David get on the phone and say, look, you have to recognize something. This idea, the contempt for group selection, is not going to die until all the guys carrying that contempt have died. It takes 20 years to establish a scientific revolution. And I said to David, no, I will do it in 12 months. I'll do it in a year. And in fact, I did do it in a year. So adventuring within evolutionary biology and then rocket science, because that's where what I was dragged into by Buzz Aldrin and Edgar Mitchell and somebody from the program director for computational intelligence at the National Science Foundation and a senior risk analyst from NASA. All these people dragged me screaming and kicking into one of my favorite places, space. So now I'm a space activist, thanks to them. I'm about to go to Kobe, Japan, to speak. And there's an entire project being put together around what's allegedly my vision for space in Malaysia, space exploration Asia, around my vision. I mean, these things are ridiculous. They're absolutely ridiculous. And it's been one adventure after another. And on the one hand, I'm extremely grateful for it. I'm glad that you all threw me out of your society. I'm glad you put me in the position of being the watcher in the most vulnerable position. I'm glad you made me use my senses, my eyes and my ears and my mind to see the things that other people don't see. It's been a hell of a ride, and I'm 70 years old. That means I'm only at the beginning of the most important 20 years of my life. The next set of adventures, God knows what they're going to be like. So to all of those who've ever rejected me, you've done me the biggest favor in the world.
Absolutely. Amazing.
Yeah.
And what do you see a difference between, do you think there's lines between like adventure and tragedy? Like what would you define as like recklessness or adventure? Like
Well, the only ultimate tragedy is death. And once upon a time, I was riding a freight train from California to the next. Freight trains don't operate the way you would think they do. They don't go from LA to Buffalo, New York, which is where I was trying to go, actually from San Francisco to Buffalo, New York. And when I first went into a freight yard and ran into a worker, I mean, first of all, he should have thrown me out. I was there illegally. And I said, how do I get a train to Buffalo, New York? And he said, son, you just don't understand the system. There's no such thing as going from San Francisco to Buffalo, New York. First of all, you have to go to the other side of the bay. I mean, I had hitchhiked from Berkeley or from San Francisco over to Berkeley, and now he's going to make me go back to the other side of the bay again. Why? Because the nation, in railroad terms, is a set of towns like Stockton, California, and Starkey, Nevada, and Rosedale, towns you have never heard of. Why? Because these are little towns with maybe 15 buildings, and that takes up a quarter of a mile by the side of the highway. And then there's a railroad yard that's 2 to 3 miles long. And freight trains come in at one end, and they're taken apart, and then they're reassembled on the other end so that each freight car can go where it's supposed to go.
Okay.
And so I was on my way from Stockton, California to Starkey, Nevada. And I was somebody, I think it was, it was a Bible school graduate from Kansas that I met who was also riding the rails illegally. And the reason he was riding the rails is because he was trying to escape. He was trying to escape from two groups that were out to get him, and they were working together. They were the Martians and the CIA.
Wow.
Yeah, and they had planted transmitters in his teeth, in his fillings. So this guy wasn't entirely sane, to say the least. But he was very sweet to me. He was very kind and generous. And so he helped me stalk the train. This is a train it looked like it was almost half a mile long. It was huge. To find a car that I could ride in. And he found me a coal car. And the coal car works like this. It has this great big load of coal. And then in order to unload the coal, it comes in over a coal pit of some kind. And its bottom, its floor, is 6 big flaps. And you simply push a lever, and the flap opens, and the coal comes falling out into the coal thing below, the coal pit below. So he found me one of these coal cars, and it had a flap open. It was the left-hand front flap, and he helped me crawl in through the flap opening, and then he locked the flap in place for me from the outside.
Okay.
Which is very sweet of him. So I stood for roughly 5 to 6 hours in this coal car on the left front flap, the one he had sealed closed for me. And it was, first of all, I tried sitting, but that didn't work because there are no shock absorbers on a coal car. I mean, the coal doesn't mind the shock, so why put shock absorbers? And which means if you try to sit and you're going at 65 miles an hour, every time it bounces, and the coal car is constantly bouncing, you fly up about 2.5 feet. Then you fall down 2.5 feet, and it nearly breaks every bone in your pelvic girdle.
Oh my gosh.
So eventually you learn this is not going to work. You can't sit down. So you were forced to stand up. Now, because it's a coal car, it's just got tons of coal dust in the bottom. And you learn things about convection currents that you never learned in any fluid dynamics class before. It turns out that when you're traveling at 65 miles an hour in a coal car, there's a sucking wind. It's a Bernoulli principle. And it sucks all of the coal dust to the front of the car. And then it sucks it up above the lip of the car into the open air, where it hits the wind that's going by at 65 miles an hour, and the coal dust is whipped back to the back of the car, where it's sucked back down again and goes through the whole procedure. So you're standing there facing forward, and your face is being literally sandblasted by coal dust for 6 hours. Right.
Amazing.
So it's very hard to see under those circumstances with this stuff coming at you at that speed. And after about 6 hours, I became uncomfortable. I just had a feeling. And so I picked up my knapsack from the left front flap of the coal car, moved it over to the right front flap of the coal car, and stood there instead. 7 minutes later, there was an enormous clatter. And the flap that I had been standing on for 6 hours came open. If I had still been standing there on that flap, I wouldn't be here having this conversation with you now.
Wow.
So the difference between tragedy and adventure, it's a very fine line. If you live to tell about it, it's an adventure. If you don't live to tell about it, it's a tragedy, but not one that anybody's ever going to hear of, unless somebody else has been following your story and is going to tell your tale, and there is nobody to do that. So that's the difference. Do you actually, are you still standing on the flap when it flies open? It's a tragedy. Have you moved to the other flap just in the nick of time? Hell, it's an adventure!
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, that leads me to the other thing I really wanted to talk to you about, which I've been getting into science fiction writing lately. Yeah. And I was wondering, being a scientist, what your feeling about science fiction writing, and if you have favorite authors if you read science fiction?
Well, I got into science fiction. I started reading 2 books a day when I was 10 years old. And I made my way through horse novels and Hardy Boys books and stuff like that very, very quickly after reading all 38 books in the Oz series, which are what I cut my teeth on. And then by the time I was 11, I got into science fiction. And it was science fiction that helped me get further and further into science. You know, when I was dragged off, my mom set up a meeting for me when I was 12 years old with the head of the graduate physics department at the University of Buffalo, my local hometown university. And I'm sure it was supposed to be a 5-minute courtesy session. But that's not what it turned out to be. The 2 of us sat there for over an hour in his office. Why? Because the hottest topic in theoretical physics at the time was Big Bang versus steady state. Fred Hoyle said that the universe was the way it had been forever, and that periodic, or that there were spots in the universe that were spots of creativity, and those spots of creativity, hydrogen and helium, came out of the nothingness through a creative force of some kind. And then there was George Gamow, a Russian with an incredible sense of humor, about 6'3" tall, a very charismatic guy, and he was supporting a point of view called the Big Bang. Well, it turned out the very year, I later learned this through research for one of my books, that was the very year when I was sitting in that office at the age of 12 with the head of the graduate physics department at the University of Buffalo. It was the year Fred Hoyle knew he was about to defeat Big Bang theory and put it in his grave forever. Nobody would ever hear of it again. Fred Hoyle was wrong, but it meant that was the degree of contention, of controversy about these two. That's what the 2 of us discussed for an hour, and the interpretation of the Doppler effect shift.
And you were 12?
I was 12, yeah, but I'd been in science for 2 years by then, since I was 10. And to him, it was an absolutely fascinating conversation. It was certainly fascinating for me. It was the first time I ever really got to discuss this with another human being. Do you know where I got almost all of that information, Ivy? From science fiction. From showing up at the local magazine store 3 days before Galaxy Science Fiction magazine arrived every single month, and then having to come back the next day and the next day and the next day until finally the magazine arrived, and then reading the magazine from cover to cover. and complete with its nonfiction articles, its fiction articles, everything. I hadn't started, I mean, I got into reading the Scientific American from cover to cover. I don't know if I'd started that yet. But without science fiction was my introduction to science. And it wasn't my total introduction. It was the book that had converted me when I was 10 years old to science was my real introduction, I guess. But I wouldn't be here. And the same is true with most of the people that I know in science. Science fiction has played a very important role in their lives. And science fiction is the feeler that science uses to feel its way into impossible new things. Today, in cosmology, the multiverse concept, the concept that there are many, 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 many universes, that's taken for granted, although I don't believe it. There's no evidence for it. There really is no evidence for it whatsoever, except the existence of a mathematics that describes it. But hey, there are lots of different kinds of math that describe lots of different things. And just because math describes something doesn't mean that it's true somewhere. At any rate, well, that idea of multiple universes was all over the science fiction of the 1950s. That's why I looked on this idea of multiverses with contempt. It was something I knew from the time I was a child. And there's no more evidence for it today than there was back then. And people like Max Tegmark, he was at the University of Pennsylvania or something like that. I think he's in MIT now, saying that every form of mathematical possibility is a universe. But that's a hypothesis, Max. That's not reality. Prove it to me. Show me some evidence. And Max doesn't feel the obligation to do that. And he's got a lot of support. It's not just him working on this multiverse thing. I mean, Brian Greene did a whole book about it. But again, science fiction is out there as a feeler. Science fiction was looking into this back in the 1940s and 1950s. And if you read The God Problem, How a Godless Cosmos Creates, you'll see how the mathematics that led to the idea of multiple universes developed with a guy named Bernard Riemann in the 1860s and 1870s, and how it goes all the way back to a thread of speculation that began 2,300 years ago with Euclid, and a bunch of people saying, well, is the parallel postulate, the idea that two lines never meet, is that really true if you extend those lines to infinity? Speculation about that lasted for 2,300 years, for God's sakes, and led to what Riemann was doing, which led in turn to the idea that every form of mathematics is a potential universe, so the universes must exist. That's a hypothesis. Remember, put out ideas and then test them. Show me some evidence. Nonetheless, without science fiction probing things like that, once upon a time, there was this wacko. He was in France, and he was a part-time stockbroker, and he wasn't terribly successful at it. And he wanted to be a great writer. And there were several great writers who were lionized in France. They were superstars in France, and he wanted to be like them. And he decided to write a story about something totally off the wall. The story was, well, the American Civil War had just ended, and the American Civil War was the most industrialized war in the history of humanity because it used railroad trains and all kinds of modern things that hadn't existed before. And he imagined that the artillery guys in the Second World War, in the Civil War, developed this cannon so huge that you could literally put a carriage in its mouth and shoot a carriage. So he imagined putting a bunch of people in a carriage in the mouth of this cannon and shooting them to the moon. Now look, if you had been his wife, his mother, you would have said, look, you've got to earn a living. You're not doing as well as you should be with your stockbroker stuff. Work on that, for God's sakes. At least earn a living. This stuff of cannon shooting people to the moon, you've got to be kidding. The great writers that you want to be like, they don't write crazy shit like that. They write down-to-earth stories about real human beings and real society. And this is just nuttiness. Well, the book was called Earth to the Moon, From Earth to the Moon. The guy's name was Jules Verne. And he was one of the founders of the entire field of science fiction. And a whole bunch of kids grew up on From Earth to the Moon. And they wanted to turn what was the fantasy and From Earth to the Moon to a reality. And among them were a guy in Russia called Tsiolkovsky and a guy in Germany called, I believe it was Hans Oberth. And the two of them became so obsessed with turning From Earth to the Moon into a reality. They imagined, first of all, they imagined a slightly different way to handle things. Instead of putting all of the explosives in the cannon and shooting the carriage, they imagined putting all the explosives in the back of the carriage.
Wow.
And actually, it was a very old technology. The Chinese had developed it 600 years earlier. And it was called this thing where you put all the explosives behind you, right underneath you. I mean, first of all, it's a crazy idea. Would you really want to be taken to the moon by something that had enough explosives in its tail to blow up a city?
Probably not.
No, it would be. I would think it would be a safety hazard.
Yeah. Probably, yeah.
But this way of doing things is called a rocket. And rockets have been adopted whole hog as military devices as early as the War of 1812. Remember, there's a song, and it's about being in a besieged city during the War of 1812. And the song has this line, and the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air. Have you ever heard that song?
I have, yes.
Yes, it's called the American Anthem.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Well, that's because they were using these things called Congreve rockets in the War of 1812. So the rocket technology had been around for a while. Tsiolkovsky and Oberth grew up glued to From Earth to the Moon, Jules Verne's crazy fantasy. They imagined what would happen if you used rockets instead of cannons. And they both wrote books about what would happen if you used rockets instead of cannons to get to what we now call outer space. And there were a bunch of kids in Germany who grew up glued to From Earth to the Moon, and Tsiolkovsky and Oberth. And they started a rocket club in Germany, making amateur rockets, trying to do what had been inspired by Jules Verne and what Tsiolkovsky and Oberth had said was possible. Get people into space using rockets. But, you know, they were kids, and they couldn't afford much of a budget, so the rockets were this big around, you know, like pipes. Not big enough to get a human into space, not even big enough to get a mouse into space. And then there was a major political change in Germany, and a new leader came to power who loved off-the-wall technologies. He absolutely loved off-the-wall technologies. Well, one of the two kids from the Rocket Club, the two kids were named Wernher von Braun and Willy Ley. And Willy Ley took a look at the political program of this leader and said, I'm out of here, and moved to the United States. But Wernher von Braun stuck around and managed to convince the powers that be under this new government to put their military development money, the development of new weapons, into his technology. Now, the leader had imagined that he had this magnificent idea, and his magnificent idea, the first people that would jump on board with it, aside from the Germans, were the English, because it was the idea that there was a master race, and the master race should control all the world. And the master race included the Germans and the English, so obviously the English were going to jump on board immediately. But the English didn't sign on, and he was really pissed off. So he started planning an invasion of England, among other things, and he also wanted some way to bombard the hell out of London to get revenge on them for spurning him, for rejecting him. Well, these things, this big around, these things that had come out of From Earth to the Moon, and Tsiolkovsky and Oberth, he was told by Wernher von Braun, give me enough money, I'll go from pipes this big to pipes this big, and then we'll be able to bombard London.
Wow.
So he got all the money from Hitler that he needed to establish a base at Peenemünde. He got slave labor to help him out, and he built these great big rockets. They were called V2s that started raining down on London. Well, eventually, Adolf Hitler, the leader of Germany, who had funded all of this rocket development and funded Wernher von Braun, he began to lose, and the Allies, the Americans, the English, started moving on into his territory from the west, and the whole Soviet army, the Russians, were closing in on him from the other side, from the east. And it looked like these Nazi guys who had funded Werner von Braun were about to be knocked out of power. So Werner von Braun in Peenemünde, this hilly landscape where he was developing all of these rockets, I think it was hilly, gave his brother a bicycle. His brother was also a full-grown adult at the time, and said, go down there and make sure that we are captured by the Americans, not by the Russians. I mean,
Wow.
Stalin, who ran Russia, had a nasty habit of killing people, and that wasn't what Werner wanted. So his brother got on the bicycle, drove down to the American front, and said to the first important-looking person he could find a line which later became famous in science fiction: "Take me to your leader."
Wow.
He said, I want to talk to Eisenhower. I want to surrender to Eisenhower. And this was a lowly tank man. He was just a step above private. He didn't exactly have access to Eisenhower. But at any rate, so here's Werner von Braun, who's inspired by this wacko book that was written by Jules Verne.
Wow.
And he goes to the United States and he builds the idea of a space program and getting people to the moon and having a space station in space. And he gets a guy named Chesley Bonestell, who is a scenery designer in Hollywood, and who also designs the facade of the Chrysler Building. And it turns out that in his spare time, Chesley Bonestell has this secret obsession. He makes space paintings. So Werner gets him on board, and they lay out the most visually gorgeous vision of space program you've ever seen in your life. And it's so gorgeous that Collier's magazine, which is a big format, glossy, full-color magazine, runs first one article on it with tons of pictures. It's so popular, they run another issue on it with tons of pictures. They end up running 4 issues on it with tons of pictures. All because some guy who couldn't make it as a stockbroker wanted to be the next great writer in France, and came up with an idea that was obviously going to make sure he'd never be seen as a great writer. This wacko idea of building a big cannon and firing carriages into space. So what does that mean about science fiction? First of all, in a book called The Genius of the Beast, one of my books, it talks about the importance of an infrastructure of fantasy. We stand on an infrastructure of fantasy and reach to the next level. And without that infrastructure, the next level we could reach toward would be abysmal. But with layer after layer of infrastructure of fantasy, it becomes increasingly high. It's like building a skyscraper, building it to the moon. And it's the science fiction authors who help build that infrastructure of fantasy, from which scientists benefit, from which you and I benefit, from which John F. Kennedy benefited when he said we are going to go to the moon, not because it is easy, but because it is hard. Without science fiction, we would no longer have our antennae, our feelers, feeling our way into the next realm of possibility.
Do you see the science fiction authors as scientists, or do you see them more as creative minds? Where do you feel like that?
Well, there are all kinds of science fiction authors, and they have very different degrees of understanding of science. Isaac Asimov, I don't know how many books he wrote, it was in the hundreds. But Isaac Asimov was such a participant in the scientific process, in my opinion. You need synthesizers in science. And Isaac Asimov did that. And what's his name? The guy that I was compared to once. It was Buckminster Fuller's archivist, who said that Howard Bloom was the Buckminster Fuller and Arthur C. Clarke of the 21st century. Bless her soul. And Arthur C. Clarke, he took a science fiction and he conceived of the idea, I believe it was, of communication satellites in space, and then helped make the communication satellites in space. So Arthur C. Clarke was a purveyor of fantasy who helped take that fantasy and turn it into reality. So some science fiction authors get the benefit of actually being able to step into science. Greg Bear, who's one of the most award-winning science fiction authors of our time. Greg and I are friends, and Greg was invited to the Philadelphia Philosophical Society, the National Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, to give his view of how things work at the microorganismic level. Why? Because he took the ideas of the existing science, of his day and synthesized them in a way that no scientist had, and saw the bigger picture implicit in that in a way that no scientist had. So he was both a participant in the scientific process and a science fiction author, and still continues to be to this day. So there is a possibility for science fiction authors to actually be at least synthesizers. Look, you know that at the age of 10, I became absolutely hooked on science. It became my religion. It became my life. And when I was 16, I got an opportunity to work at the world's largest cancer research facility. And to make sure that I didn't do too much damage, they put a real scientist over my head, whose name was Phil Fish. And every day, a little group of us, the students that were allowed into this program, were all 3 years older than I was. I wasn't really supposed to be there. I was too young for the program. But I'd been snuck in by a student of Linus Pauling's, who was the head of the biochemistry department. And so we'd go down to lunch every day in the cafeteria, and we'd have these exhilarating sessions. But Phil Fish, the scientist who'd been put over my head, took me to his office when I first met him, and he showed me his desk, which was very long. And he had about 30 books over on this side of the desk and about 40 books over on this side of the desk. Well, that's the way it looked. And they were all in German. And he said, my job is to synthesize, and then he named a molecule whose name I've forgotten, unfortunately, very long and complex molecule. And he said, I've read all of these books on the right in German, but I will have to read all of the books on the left in German before I'm able to finish this process. So for 5 years of his life, Phil Fish was going to spend his time synthesizing one molecule. But Phil was fascinated when we had these brainstorming sessions at lunch, and the brainstorming sessions became so exhilarating that we started doing them after work too. We went over to the house of one of the kids and continued them. And I realized something basic. There's no way in hell I wanted to be what Phil Fish was. There's no way in hell I wanted to be a gopher constantly digging his way further and further into the ground and getting further and further away from the light. That my job, because I was also reading Nietzsche at the time, and Nietzsche talked about this. Nietzsche said the vast majority of humans live in the valley where it's safe, where they are protected by the mountains on one side and the mountains on the other side. But because they're protected by mountains on both sides, because they've hidden themselves away deep in this valley, they almost never see the sun. In the morning, the sun comes up over this mountain range and they are in the shadow. And in the evening, the sun is going down over the opposite mountain range and they are in shadow. It's only briefly at noon that they ever see the sun crossing the sky. They live in darkness because they're huddled together for safety. But the Ubermensch, the Superman dares to climb the mountain, stand on its top, and stand in the sun. Well, that's what I needed to do for whatever reason. So I saw Phil as the gopher digging his way further and further into the ground and not being able to see the landscape around him. But I wanted to be the eagle soaring over the entire landscape, seeing the big picture that knitted everything together. So that was my role. That role is a synthesizer. So science needs both its specialists and its synthesizers, because the synthesizers are the ones who come up with the new pictures of the invisible world, the new concepts that give the gophers some reason to tunnel, that describe why it's useful to come up with a new molecule like the one that Phil was coming up with. That's the scientific process, and the synthesizers are not recognized. If you look for scientific synthesizer in Google book search, you'll find very little because that's not an established category in science. But when it comes to something like Thomas Kuhn, whose book on scientific revolutions wouldn't be written until I was in my 40s or something like that, and I'd already spent decades in science. But his concept is very sound. And it's the synthesizers who bring you the new paradigms, the paradigm shifts. So that's my task, and also science fiction authors and science journalists. There's a woman named Sharon Bagley Sharon Bagley was the science editor for Newsweek for a long time when Newsweek was still a major magazine. Then she was the science editor for the Wall Street Journal for a long time, and now she's a science editor for Reuters. And Sharon wrote an article about, there was a book that came out from Timothy Wilson, who's the cousin of David Sloan Wilson. David Sloan Wilson is the guy who said, "Stop this," when I started the group selection squad. "You're going to destroy what I've worked on my entire career." And then told me that I had to wait until the supporters of the individual selectionist only school died off before group selection would be accepted. And I changed things in a year. So that's David Sloan Wilson, who's the master of group selection and what he calls multi-level selection. His cousin is Timothy Wilson. Timothy Wilson came up with a book about the adaptive unconscious. In other words, he revived the Freudian idea of a subconscious, which had been not discredited, it had gone out of fashion in the late 20th century. And then there was this massive campaign to bring it back. Somebody, and I never discovered who it was, with a lot of money, wanted to bring Freudianism back as a scientifically accepted proposition. And so he flew in the most amazing scientists from all over the country to New York on the first Thursday of each month. Nobody knows about this. It's never been written up to the best of my knowledge. And these guys who were being flown into New York as part of their visit to New York were told there's this guy in Brooklyn in a bedroom, and you have to meet him. You absolutely have to meet him. So they would come trooping out here to meet me at the beginning of the month. And so I met some amazing people. Well, Timothy Wilson was one of those trying to revive the idea of a subconscious or an unconscious. And he came up with the idea of an adaptive unconscious. And he wrote one book about it, and then he abandoned it and moved on to other things. Well, Sharon wrote this really brilliant article. And she brought into the article the idea, there was a piece of research in which a woman had an illness that had wiped out her. You have two touch systems, two haptic systems that sense things when I'm touching your skin or you're touching your skin. One is the slow system, one is the fast system. One is, it works with neurons that have wrappings of insulation. And that wrapping of insulation is myelin. It's a fatty sheath. So you have neurons that have a fatty sheath and neurons that don't. And she had an illness that wiped out her myelinated haptic system, her sense of physical touch. So they did an experiment, and they set up a barrier so she couldn't see what was happening with her arm. And they took a very soft brush, and in the words of the researchers, they caressed her arm with it. And they asked her what she felt was happening with her arm, and she said nothing. And they said, "Well, now how do you feel?" And she said, "I feel very warm and fuzzy." In other words, the myelinated system that goes to her conscious brain was out. But there's another system that goes to her unconscious brain, her preconscious brain, goes to apparently the limbic system, which is the emotional center. So her emotions were getting the message, even if the conscious she was not in touch with the message at all. It was Sharon Bagley, the science author, who put these two together. The idea that there's an adaptive unconscious and the idea that the experiment with the brush indicates that there are two sensory systems. One is the sensory system that goes to consciousness. The other is a sensory system that does not go to consciousness. And I believe it was me who put blind sight together with that. There are certain people who become blind, but you can put them in a complex room like this, where they have to really thread their way across all kinds of furniture or between all kinds of pieces of furniture in order to get from one end of the room to the other. And you can bring them to the door and bring them into the house and ask them, what do you see? And they'll say, "Look, you know I've been blind for the last 6 months. You know I can't see a damn thing. Don't even bother to ask a question like that." And then you can say, "Well, could you find your way over to the other side of the room?" And they'll perfectly thread their way through the furniture and find their way to the other side of the room. This is another system where we have a visual system that goes to consciousness and a visual system that does not go to consciousness. Well, but it was Sharon who provided the clue. It wasn't Timothy. It was Sharon, the science journalist. Why? Because science needs its specialists and it needs its synthesizers. And Sharon, at least in this one article, was a very successful synthesizer. So we don't recognize the role of synthesizers in science, and yet we should. I mean, Einstein said, it's the vision that is the master, the insight that's the master. And that comes to you unexpectedly. You work your life to prepare yourself for it, but when it comes all on its own. And it is what we normally regard as science, that's the servant. What he meant is that most scientists are in reality technicians. They're technicians like Phil Fish, just working on one little tiny project within a grander worldview, Weltanschauung, a picture of the invisible world. But you need the people who bring you the damn pictures of the invisible world, or there's nothing for all of these specialists, these technicians, to work on. Or they have to recognize that part of science is the grand vision, the grand concept that holds things together, and finding the next one. But, you know, science works like every human enterprise through a specialization of labor. Through some specialists who will do what Phil is doing, digging their way deep into the ground, in a hole where they cannot see, relying on somebody like you or me to see the grander picture. And the role for me, I mean, you know, I've been shoved to the outside my whole life. So being shoved to the outside has given me the privilege of being the eagle that soars over the landscape. Is the eagle in a terribly lonely position? Is the protagonist of How I Suddenly Started the 60s often in a terribly lonely position? Yes, but it's a price for something magnificent. The ability to see a vastness, a variety of things that a person just stuck in one tiny little peg in life would never have the opportunity to see. And some of us have to come back and be the storytellers, the troubadours, the people who have the adventures and then tell the tale, so that you can see what it's like to stand outside of society and adventure and taste it in lots and lots of ways you would never anticipate in your life. So that's my role in science, and that's my role in everything. And I'm very glad that rejection has given me that role. So what's next?
Well, I was inspired by what you were speaking with about Albert Einstein and the great stories about how he would discover things through creativity and sitting for hours in his bathtub watching the bubbles, floating around.
He spent his life intensely dedicated to seeing what he called God's language in the cosmos, the underlying geometry of the cosmos. And how did he get that way? When he was 10 years old, his parents, his father was an entrepreneur. And his father and his uncle, his father's brother, had created a startup in this new business that we today call the electronics business. And they were building electrical devices at a time when that was brand new. So Einstein, from the time he was a child, had his nose pressed to the mysteries of electricity, and including how you can take a certain kind of panel and shine light on it, and it will generate electricity. That was right there at the forefront of his mind from the beginning. And when he was 10, remember that's a very critical age, it's an imprinting point. That's when I got into science, but when he was 10, his family wanted to be kind, and so there were medical students who would come from strange places like Poland. And I think it was a Polish medical student that they would have over for dinner every Thursday night. And the medical student took a liking to this little kid, the 10-year-old, Albert Einstein, and would bring him books. And he brought him, there was this big series that synthesized all the most modern science of the time. It was sort of like the Scientific American, but much more readable. And it was a book series. So he brought Einstein this book series, and Einstein was just fascinated by the book series. And then he brought him a little tiny blue book. It was The Elements by Euclid. It was the book that Euclid had put together 2,300 years ago, pulling all of geometry together, and the book that all geometry has been based on in the 2,300 years since then. And Albert Einstein started taking the propositions in that book. The book works by following something Aristotle recommended as the program for science. First, establish your definitions. Then put forth your axioms, the things that you take for granted. Then put your propositions, then put your proof of the proposition. So Albert really got into this. And the book, The Elements, has a whole bunch of propositions and proofs of them. Well, Einstein started doing his own proofs of the propositions in Euclid's geometry at the age of 10. And he called this book something like his little divine gift or his little heavenly gift or something like that. To him, it was just the most amazing thing in the world. So Einstein was into electricity, and he was into the whole overview of science from a synthesizer, the guy who put together the science book series, and a guy named Bernstein or something like that. And he was into geometry, trying to find the hidden secrets of things by using geometry. And Einstein, it took me a long time, I got into Einstein when I was something like 10 years old, and I was trying to find the scissors in my house. And my mother kept a very neat house, and there was this room we almost never used. It was a big thing if it was used twice a year. It was the dining room. It was a formal dining room. And she had a mahogany chest in the formal dining room, and on the second drawer down, if you pulled it open, you would always find the scissors in exactly the same location, in the middle front of that drawer. And one day I needed to use the scissors. So I went to the drawer, and the scissors weren't there, and I couldn't find them. So I went through every room on the first floor. No scissors. Every room on the second floor, my brother's bedroom, my parents' bedroom, the bathroom, no scissors. Every room on the attic floor, a big empty bedroom in case we ever had guests, and a giant room in which I had set up all my electric trains, or my electric train. I had very little in the way of locomotives, but I used to make little boxcars from kits.
Okay.
Yeah, little H2O cars. No scissors. And after a half an hour looking for the scissors, I went back down to the dining room, because you get desperate. And I don't know if you've ever been this desperate, but sometimes you get so desperate that you imagine if you just stare hard enough at the place where something is supposed to be, it will appear. Well, I'd gotten to that stage of desperation. So I opened the drawer, and I stood there staring at this empty space where the scissors always was. And then I noticed where the scissors was. It had been in the same place the entire time. It was in my left hand. And the only thing that could possibly justify that kind of absent-mindedness was the example of Albert Einstein. So Albert Einstein became my role model from that moment forth. But it took me another 30 or 40 years to realize why Albert Einstein had been so absent-minded. In his own book, on his own autobiography, a book that I read when I was 12, Einstein described how he would, when he was living at Princeton and the Advanced Research Institute or whatever it's called at Princeton had been put together largely to house him, he would walk out of the house in the morning on his way over to the Advanced Research Institute, and he would get a block or two up the street, and then he'd hear his wife behind him, panting, trying to catch up, going, "Albert, Albert, you forgot something." And in her arms would be his pants, his shirt, his socks,
oh my gosh,
and his shoes, because Einstein had walked out of the house in his pajamas on his way up to the Advanced Research Institute. And it took me decades to realize why Albert Einstein was so absent-minded. He dedicated every bit of his brain that he could recruit to the task of figuring out the underlying geometry of the universe. The geometry that made all these little unknown, mysterious things happen. The geometry that was responsible even for things like gravity, which he figured out in 1915. And he was trying to figure out the mysteries he hadn't yet solved using that underlying geometry, the shape of the cosmos. And when you get really, really engaged in something, several times in my life I've gotten this engaged, um, you don't have any brain cells left. Remember, there's neural plasticity. One part of your brain can work very, very hard to recruit all the other parts of the brain it can get its hands on, and if it works hard enough at it, it can do it. But that means that those other parts of the brain aren't available for their normal purposes, like remembering to put your fucking shoes on. So I get to that point too, where there isn't enough brain space left for these things. So when you and Mark, who's running the camera right now, first came to the house today, Mark wanted a piece of paper. Well, I'm fortunate enough to be able to spend all my time trying to synthesize information. I don't know where the paper is in my own house, because I just don't put the time in for that kind of thing anymore. Well, think of that. That's an enormous privilege. Einstein was benefited. This is what my friend Valerius Geist, the large mammal researcher, the one who goes off with the mountain sheep for 6 months, Val Geist calls the kind of thinking that Albert Einstein was doing, or that I do, or that you and I are doing right now in front of this camera, he calls it a luxury activity. And a luxury activity is something you have the benefit of if there's a large surplus in society. And we're lucky enough to be able to do things that only societies with a surplus can do. Inventing new rituals, questioning the ways that things are, and inventing new ways of seeing, inventing new perceptual lenses, inventing new landscapes, trying to find the mind of God in the geometry of the universe, all this kind of stuff.
And do you think that Albert Einstein would you think of him like a hippie, if you would look?
Yeah, that's a very good point. Look at the way Einstein got away with wearing his hair. What does that tell you about Einstein? He was able to get away with being his own kind of person in his own kind of way. And, he was never really accepted. He didn't do that well in school. And it wasn't that he wasn't bright. It was that he was so busy teaching himself, literally as a kid. He started teaching himself after he did geometry. Then he started teaching himself advanced forms of mathematics that just had no place in the curriculum of a kid who was 12 years old. And so when he was in school, he was doing so well in these very advanced subjects that he wanted to drop out and just teach himself. His parents were scared shitless of their kid dropping out of school. In the same way that there was no phrase, dropout, that language, that term did not exist when I dropped out of college, Reed College in Portland, Oregon in 1962. There was certainly no phrase for it in Albert's time, and yet he wanted to drop out of high school. And his parents didn't want him to. And then, because his dad's business was not doing well in Germany, they moved to Italy, where things were really hopping in the world of electricity. I mean, that's where radio was being invented at the time. And Albert was going to be forced to move from one school to another, from a school in Germany to a school, or Switzerland, wherever they were, to a school in Italy. Well, Albert took advantage of that to drop out of school for a year. And it meant that when he went back to school, I mean, he taught himself all kinds of really, really advanced mathematics. But when he went back to school, he did extremely well in his science courses, and he did extremely well in his mathematics courses, but he didn't do well in the other subjects. However, he had been advised on what school to go to when he went back to Switzerland, and it was a school that if you passed, got you an automatic entry to the Zurich School of Technology, or whatever it was called, Technology Institute, the place he wanted to go to school and to college. And then he didn't do all that well in college either. So he, his girlfriend, and three other guys started a study group. And they all, when they graduated, they all applied for advanced fellowships. And everybody else in his study group got an advanced fellowship, except Einstein and his girlfriend, who he had been helping with her homework. So Einstein didn't do that well in school because he was so busy learning. He was too busy learning to pay that much attention in school. And you know that he loved teaching. That's what he really wanted to do. But he kept getting little tiny tutoring jobs and then losing them. And finally, a friend of his, the father of a friend of his from his study group, got him a job in the patent department as a patent something or other third class. I mean, he was very much on the bottom of the pecking order, very much on the bottom of the hierarchy, the totem pole. But that gave him the time to keep working on what he was working on. And in his Annus Mirabilis, his Year of Miracles, he published four papers, maybe it was five, I'm not sure. 5 scientific papers from a guy who hadn't done that well even in university. And one or two of them had been written while he was still a college student. And the other problem that he'd been working on was the mystery of this. From the time he was 10, he and the guy who used to come over to his house, Max, the medical student from Poland, Max Talmud was his name. Max Talmud had shown him magnets, and I think his uncles had shown him magnets. And he wanted to come to explain the mysterious something that drew a piece of iron to a magnet over a distance, an invisible force of some kind. He wanted to understand those invisible somethings, and he was sure he could do it using geometry. So that's why he didn't do well in school, and he liked the job in the patent office because it gave him time to think, and because he was not regimented the way he would have been if he'd been a professor in a university. He would have been conformity enforced to go along with the existing view of things. And he loved the privilege of being an outsider. He loved the privilege of being able to think in his own way and arrive at solutions to problems in his own way with no pressures from peers. So eventually a guy named something like Stiglitz, who had helped develop the engineering of how to get electrons and photons and atoms to work together so that you could ping an atom with an electron and get it to turn out a photon. In other words, you could turn electricity into light. The technology that's used in every one of these display screens and in TV sets. This is electrons pinging atoms to produce light, photons. And so the guy who had worked out the technology behind this came to Albert and said, I think I really should go back to school to get my advanced degrees in physics, because he had a theory of what electrons are and what photons are. That he had the theory that they're little whirlwinds, that they're little whirlpools, little vortices. And Einstein said, no, absolutely do not go back to school. And he said, take a tinker's job. And by that, he meant get a job that you can do, not using your brain very much, that will pay your daily salary so you can think independently. Do not go into academia where they will force you into a mold of thinking and then enforce that conformity, police you viciously. So Einstein valued independence, being an outsider, tremendously, or he wouldn't have had that haircut. Because remember all the changes in haircuts that occurred in the 50 or 60 years that he wore that particular haircut.
Yes.
And he got away with it because his ideas were accepted.
And what would you say would be the definition of a hippie?
Well, we were defined by Time magazine, which gave us a name. I mean, various people claim credit for coming up with the word hippie, but it's Time magazine that covered the hippie movement week after week after week and got across its identity. And what would it mean to be a hippie? To me, it was the second law of science. The first two rules of science are courage, the truth at any price, including the price of your life, which means if you have to go out and adventure and you do risk death, so be it. Screw it. The second law of science, look at things right under your nose if you've never seen them before, and then proceed from there. And so hippiedom for me was a matter of crossing boundaries, adventuring your tail off, sensing the world in whole new ways, and being free to walk around barefoot for 6 months, and to the point where your feet didn't mind if you walked over gravel or ground glass or snow or ice. I used to walk around in Portland, Oregon, and Seattle in snow and ice, barefoot. It didn't bother me. Wear your hair the way you like. But when the social groups were self-forming in 1962. And I had an awful lot of control because even though I didn't regard myself as any kind of a leader, I was some sort of catalytic leader. And that gives you the freedom to do things your own way, and people will then accept it and follow you. And that's been my experience, Ivy, my whole life. You know, when I've come into a field, they've always let me come. They don't want me as a member of the group. They never want me as a member of the group, and I wouldn't be comfortable as a member of the group. But they are willing, in whatever field I go into, to accept me as some kind of a leader. Well, that gives you a remarkable privilege, because then you can do what Einstein wanted to do, which is pursue your own independent way of thought and find that it influences other people and is accepted by them. And that's just the ultimate kind of freedom. So it's hard for me to say what a hippie was, because later the concept of what I helped kick off was commercialized. And it meant wearing tie-dye T-shirts, and it meant reciting a slogan, peace and love, and it meant flower power, and it meant making Haight-Ashbury into a vivid center of the movement. But when I came back to the States after being gone for 14 months, and I saw this stuff that I'd found just on the sheer basis of trying to find vital truths or vital adventures or vital heroic deeds, and I found it had been mass marketed, I felt uncomfortable with it. The sexual revolution that we'd helped kick off in 1962, well, that I was comfortable with for some reason. But the rest of it, finding kids who would have beaten the shit out of me when I was a kid, wearing the kind of long hair that I was wearing, that was not comfortable. They had taken over something that was sacred to me. And so I was not comfortable with it. I was no more comfortable with kids who could easily beat the shit out of me than I'd ever been. And now it had become cliquish. Would it have ever accepted me? No, not really. So I was an outsider even to me it was like, occasionally you eat a cheese sandwich, and then at 11:30 at night when you're going to sleep, you belch, and all of a sudden you feel that taste of cheese sandwich all over again. Well, it was like that. It was the afterbirth that I saw in the rest of the 1960s, from 1963 to 1973, because the 60s just kept going, even into the early 70s. But I was glad it was there as an alternative. And there was something else. When I came back from California after accidentally helping start the hippie movement, and I was back in my hometown of Buffalo again, and I met with a friend who had made me, when I was 16, the head of basically the head of the political committee, the social action committee for the local Unitarian youth group. I was Jewish, atheist, Zionist, and he was a Catholic. That didn't matter. The Unitarians were the ones who accepted us the most. Well, I saw him again on the University of Buffalo campus, and I tried to explain to him that whatever the movement did not have a name yet, but whatever it was, it broke down into two different subcultures. One was the spiritual subculture, which I was very much a part of, and the other was the political subculture. And I didn't feel comfortable with the politicals because to me they looked like dogmatic totalitarians. They looked like remarkably intolerant people. You had to conform to the way they wanted you to do things. And I wasn't at all comfortable with that. Well, I wrote to Margot Adler, who is a New York correspondent for NPR, National Public Radio, 3 weeks ago, asking her if she wanted to read How I Suddenly Started the 60s, because Margot has been very nice to me over the last 3 or 4 years, very nice. And she said, well, I'll make a deal with you. I'll buy your book if you buy my book about how I accidentally started the 60s.
Nice.
Yeah. So I bought her book, and it's called Heretic's Heart, and it's very good. And it's Margot grew up as a political kid. So she grew up in the political hippie movement. And I, helped advance the spiritual hippie movement, even though I've been involved in politics since I was at least 16 years old, heavily involved. What have I done in politics? At the age of 16, I headed that social action committee, which was into breaking down barriers that kept blacks from moving out of black neighborhoods. It was called redlining in those days. Then, in 1964, I wrote position papers for a congressional candidate who just couldn't possibly win because he was in a district that was 75% Republican, and he won. And then I eventually helped Amnesty International develop its beachhead in North America, I helped Farm Aid start. I worked with the NAACP, the United Negro College Fund, and the Black United Fund. The United Negro College Fund gave several awards to my office for our work. I put together the first public radio spots for solar power in 1981, and I co-founded Music in Action, which was the leading anti-censorship group. And we fought toe-to-toe with Tipper Gore, Al Gore's wife, and Susan Baker, the wife of a cabinet, I think he was Secretary of State, her husband, and some very, very powerful people who actually tried to end my career. But you know, when people try to end your career, that's a big sign that whatever you're doing is worth doing. So I've been very heavily politically active my whole life, but it's not the politics that I'm talking about and how I suddenly served the 60s, because I was apolitical back then. What I was doing was just seeking the most essential truths I could possibly get my hands on. And Margot will tell you what the political thing was like.
And where do you feel like that movement is now?
Well, you know, all the spiritual elements. Remember, I was off seeking Zen Buddhist Satori. And my concept of Zen Buddhist Satori came from reading about the beatniks every week in Time magazine from the time I was 16, and going out and buying a book or two on Zen Buddhism, but as seen through Western eyes. Zen Buddhism, remember, was an import to Japan. It had come from India. It had made its way all the way to Japan. The Zen was the warrior interpretation of Buddhism in Japan. Quite a conflict, because Buddha was trying to end suffering, and being a warrior is all about inflicting suffering. So there was an Asian element that had made its way from India to China to finally Japan. It had been westernized. And Edna St. Vincent Millay and T.S. Eliot played a very powerful role in how I interpreted that. T.S. Eliot wrote the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, and that poem said, "If you have anything adventurous to do it now. Start it today." So I've been doing it ever since I was 16. And Edna St. Vincent Millay said, if you want to see the infinite in the tiniest of things, expand your empathic centers so that you can understand the experience of just about everybody on the planet. Those became very important to me. There was Sigmund Freud's daughter, Anna, who talked about defense mechanisms. So I felt I needed to escape defense mechanisms in order to achieve Zen Buddhist Satori, enlightenment. And there were the French surrealists, who I just immersed myself in. I marinated myself in the French surrealists. And there was it Rimbaud, who said, talked about the deliberate dissociation of the senses. So I was on a spiritual quest powered by this weird mix of elements. Where is that quest today? Where is the search for adventure outside the bounds of society today? In one area, it's very alive in the tech business. It's very alive in the tech business because you have kids who are just coming up with whole new ways of doing things and founding companies based on them. Everything from Amazon, which Steve Bezos founded when he was 30 years old, to Microsoft, which is now a stodgy, old, hateful company, but once upon a time it was a pioneer, founded by some kids who were just absolutely fascinated with these new things called computers in Seattle when they were teenagers. The Apple, which was founded by two kids in a garage who were also fascinated by the possibility of these new chips that were becoming available. And right down to Snapchat, which was founded by a 21 or 22-year-old kid. These are kids out there exploring a new frontier. Now, they're not doing it with a kind of personal adventure. They're not risking much. If their companies fail, they can always go back to their parents and start another one. They're pretty well off middle-class kids. But that's adventure of one kind. But the kind of piling up adventure after adventure and adventuring in other people's minds, we are blindfolding ourselves with a concept called multiculturalism. And multiculturalism is about the very opposite of what it claims. Instead of respecting other cultures, it is about pretending that other cultures are the same as ours. And that's make-believe. Other cultures are not the same as ours. Other cultures are radically different in their assumptions. And I don't know of anybody who's going out there and really exploring those other cultures for what they are. We have a lot of kids who are going out on Fulbright fellowships, but they're assuming, even when those other cultures are right under their nose, that those other cultures are not strange and alien things. Well, I got news for you. Until you put yourself in the mind of that other culture and think and feel like it's people, you haven't understood that other culture. So I, in roughly 1994, after Osama bin Laden declared war on Western civilization, literally declared war on Western civilization, I started collecting all the works of Osama bin Laden, every single fatwa, every single statement he put out. And I realized this is a tremendously knowledgeable guy. He is a scholar, but he's a scholar in something I don't understand. At that point, I started researching Islam when I was 18, 19 years old. And despite all those decades of researching Islam, I didn't have a clue as to what he was talking about. He was talking about place names that I'd never ever heard before, and I'm pretty good at geopolitics and stuff like that. I've been in it since I was 16, and I didn't recognize any of the place names. And he was talking about people and battles I'd never ever heard of. So I tried to decode him. I tried to figure out what in the world he was talking about. And ultimately, I found my way to a set of documents that I had never previously seen. I mean, the Quran was there in plain sight. That was very helpful, but it's a very confusing document because it's like taking a jigsaw puzzle, shaking it up in the box, and it's a bunch of random pieces, the Quran, the way that it's organized. And then there's the Hadith, and those are the eyewitness accounts of Muhammad, all the little stories about Muhammad and all of his sayings, and they just gathered every bit of them that they could, and that's the Hadith. But that's like a jigsaw puzzle box that's been shaken seriously, too. But then there are the two first real biographies of Muhammad and of the early days of Islam. One is Ibn Ishaq, who was a 9th century biographer, so he was removed by about 2 centuries, came about 2 centuries after Muhammad, and after Islam had established the biggest empire in the history of mankind, an empire 11 times the size of the conquest of Alexander the Great, 5 times the size of the Roman Empire, and 7 times the size of the United States, the biggest empire the world has ever seen. So Ibn Ishaq was living in a vastly different world than Muhammad's world, but he wrote a biography of Muhammad, and it's very intense, very heavily researched. And then Al-Tabari, another Muslim living within this vast Muslim empire, wrote a 31-volume history of Muhammad and the early days. So I took all these books, put them together, put all of the incidents that were scattered like jigsaw puzzles on a timeline to see how they made a story, just to try to understand Osama bin Laden. And then I put it together in a book, and it's called The Muhammad Code. So that book is available now too, and it's the only book I know of that tells the story of how Muhammad invented jihad and how he invented what we call Islamic extremism. He invented militant Islam himself. It's about how he invented a new form of state, a military dictatorship, a totalitarian military dictatorship in which if you disagreed in any way, you were killed in the middle of the night when you were sleeping, period. That was it, default mechanism. It's about how he invented all of this, and it's the key to understanding all that vocabulary in Osama bin Laden's work. So what was I trying to do? Adventure in another mind again. Think like Osama bin Laden. Feel like Osama bin Laden. See what his worldview is like. And that's what we should be doing to other cultures. Seeing the world through their eyes so we understand how different they are, because it's only going to contribute to who we are. Plus, if these people decide that they want to bomb us, and that's what Osama has decided, we need to understand why and what he's thinking. When suicide bombers pull off 2 bombings in Volgograd as a warning against the Sochi Olympics, we need to understand what they're thinking that allows them to be perfectly content with blowing themselves up. And in fact, it's not that hard to understand. Life is short. Paradise is forever. So is hell. If you don't go out doing God's will, you're going to hell. But if you go out trying to expand Islam to the entire world, which is what Muhammad himself laid out as the program in 628 AD. You're trying to liberate all of humanity. Yes, you may kill 36 people, but that's to save 36 million or 3.6 billion people. So, and that gives you an express ticket to paradise. Well, paradise is forever. Life is short. That's why the Muslim militants can say, we value death more than you value life. Hence, we're going to win. But you've got to understand that. Sun Tzu tells you to defeat an enemy, walk in his shoes, breathe his breaths, think his thoughts, emote his emotions, so you can anticipate what he or she will do. Well, that's the privilege you get from adventure, for God's sakes. People keep asking me, you're writing a book, the Muhammad Code, saying that Muhammad established jihad, which he did, no question about it. Aren't you afraid of being killed? Well, remember the first law of science, the truth at any price, including the price of your life. The fact that you're going to be killed only makes it more exciting and more worth doing. And it makes it more worth doing because it means other timid people, like the ones who ask the question, aren't you afraid of being killed, are not going to do this. Because they are afraid of being killed. Screw them. Your job is the ultimate adventure, the ultimate heroic deed. And heroic deeds come from overcoming death, period. And what T.S. Eliot says in his poem is that he imagines these wonderful maidens in the sea, the mermaids. And he says, I have heard the mermaids singing each to each. I do not think that they will sing to me. Meaning because he has gone into middle age without ever doing the adventurous things that he wanted to do that would have defined him. Girls are not going to pay attention to him. Guess what? Guess what's the ultimate reward? Guess what's the ultimate reward when two lizards go up against each other to see who's going to be the alpha and who's not? Guess what's the ultimate reward when two lobsters go up against each other in a height contest to see who's going to be on top and who's not? Guess what happens when two puppies go up against each other? Well, it's extreme in the case of wolf puppies. The one who comes out on top is going to be the only one in the group that ever has the privilege of sex, ever. All the rest of the males are going to go their entire lives without ever having sex. What's the privilege for lobsters? The winning lobster controls all the females, all of them. He has sex, and the loser never has sex, unless someday he comes out on top, which is very unlikely, because when two lobsters or lizards or puppies go up against each other, and you can see this particularly strongly with crayfish. The top one, after he wins his victory, is just filled with this hormonal group, a hormonal cocktail of the victor that makes him magnificent. And in the words of the crayfish researchers, it's as if the crayfish that loses goes through a brain transplant. He's no longer what he was just a few minutes ago, because he gets a cocktail of hormones that are the hormones of the loser. And they make him skulk close to the ground, having no confidence whatsoever. They turn him into a different kind of animal, a loser. And so what T.S. Eliot is saying is that if you ever expect women to pay serious attention to you, if you ever expect to be the top lobster that gets all the girls, the top lizard that gets all of the girls, the top puppy that gets all of the sex, if you ever expect that at all, you're going to have to do your heroic deeds. And what are heroic deeds? They're deeds in which you go face to face with death and you say, screw you to death, and you win. And I'm still into that, so I can't understand why these people could ask a question like, aren't you afraid of being killed? No, of course not. They have me on Saudi television all the time. They have me on Iranian television all the time. My two biggest fans, one splits his time between Islamabad and Pakistan and Dubai. He's the trainer to the national cricket team in Dubai, and the national cricket team in Dubai is the equivalent to the national basketball champions in the United States of America. And his gym in Dubai has won a reputation as being the most expensive training center in Dubai. He's my biggest fan in the world, period. Another huge fan, the only one who's ever gone in front of an audience and held up one of my books and said, this is the future of Dubai, is on the ruling council of Dubai. He's the senior aide to the Prime Minister of the United Arab Emirates, and he also runs a little company called Emir Realty, which built the world's tallest building and has real estate holdings in 15 countries. And it's a $33 billion company. His name is Mohammed Alibar. And he literally went in front of the Arabian Business and Economic Forum and said the future of Dubai is in this book called The Genius of the Beast by Howard Bloom, and I'm going to read. And he read them passages from it to show them what the future of Dubai is in his imagination. He said, I gave a copy of this book to the sheep because it is our future. And then when my fan Amir Siddiqui, the one who's the trainer to the national cricket team in Pakistan, was starting his business in Dubai, he said, I'm in Dubai now, can I do anything for you? And I said, yes, please get me Muhammad Alibar's personal email address, because another friend of mine is from one of the three leading families in the Arab world, the family that in 653 AD, when the Muslims came into my country, Israel, and wiped out 40 Jewish towns and took over in Jerusalem. When they did that, his family was among the conquerors, and they were given control over the Holy Sepulchre. So he got me Alibar's business address, which didn't get me anywhere. And I asked Amir if he would get me Alibar's personal address. So he got it for me. And I sent an email to Muhammad Alibar saying, if you ever see a New York trip in your schedule, please let me know, and we'll get together and brainstorm. And I got a message back from his personal assistant 3 hours later saying, when Mr. Alibar opened his laptop this morning and saw your email, it made his day. And he wanted me to tell you that he named a racehorse after your book. So there's a racehorse running around on aristocratic Arabian racetracks, named after the Genius of the Beast, that is named after a book by a Zionist atheist Jew. So does that indicate there's any possibility for world peace? Yes, to me it does. But I would imagine that part of my respect in the Islamic world comes from the simple fact that I've taken the time to really, really study the root documents of their culture and to understand what how militants think, because they're up against the militants too. The militants are the greatest threat they have, because these are pluralist, tolerant, modernist Muslims, and in the views of the militants, they are all apostates, and there's only one thing to do with an apostate: death, period. So I've been picketed here in the United States as a racist by the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. They did sit-down strikes against me in 1988 in the offices of Omni magazine. But they were trying to make a point that I had written a chapter of my book, The Lucifer Principle, which was published in Omni, that pointed out the violence in Western society before 1750. And it was monstrous, absolutely monstrous. And pointed out the violence in Islamic society. And they said, no, he's saying that Muslims are all violent. And that's not what I was saying. Muslims are not all violent. And they sat there picketing for 4 days until a Pan-American flight went down over Lockerbie, Scotland, bombed by a Muslim bomber. And it was embarrassing for them to be sitting there in the lobby saying Muslims are not violent. After that deed, 244 people or something like that had died, and they disappeared. And then the Council for American Islamic Relations showed up in the offices of my publisher in 1998, 10 years later, trying to convince my publisher that everything I'd written about Islam was false, and that I should be, that my publisher should take my books out of print immediately and make sure I never published another book again. And the odd thing is, my publisher then became very nervous about how accurate my statements were about Islam. I quintuple check all of my facts. I don't just double check them or triple check them. I become insecure over and over again about how accurate they are, and go back and check them all over again in different places. And it turned out that when I did the fact checking additional fact checking, by the way, my publishers, what you see in my books as endnotes is only a tiny amount of the real endnotes for the books, because the publishers don't want books in which there are this many pages of endnotes. It would make it too expensive. So they always cut out at least half of my endnotes. So when I went back and re-fact checked for the 6th and 7th time all of the facts, it turned out that everything I said was on target. Everything that they said was false they were false. Either they didn't know their own literature, or they were using something called taqiyya, which is strategic lying. It's a very important concept in Islam. Muhammad said the way to win wars is through what he called, well, it's translated as deceit, deceiving the enemy, lying to the enemy. And, Muhammad then made it very clear what he meant. He was up against an army of Meccans, and the army of Meccans include a Jewish squadron, and the Jews had allied with the Meccans. And Muhammad said to one of his men, those guys in the Jewish squadron, you grew up with them. You used to play with them when you were 4 years old and 5 years old. You know them. Go out and lie to them. So I don't remember what the lie was, but in fact, the guy went out to the Jewish squadron and said, well, you remember me. We played together when we were 4 or 5 years old. We've known each other all our lives. And I still feel as fond of you as I did back then. And then he gave them a lie. And the lie was designed to throw them off course, to make them attack the wrong place or something like that. That's basic in Islam. Not every Muslim, that doesn't mean every Muslim you know is going to lie. I don't think my friends and my Muslim friends ever lied to me.
Of course, yeah.
I don't know, how can you tell? But I believe in their sincerity. But it is a standard part of the Islamic vocabulary of deeds, good deeds, to lie if you're lying to the enemy. So you never know what you're being told. But I hopefully one of the reasons they respect me is because I know their culture, and hopefully they're not lying to me.
So what's next for you?
Well, that's a good question. There's a book that I started to work on. It's a book, actually, I've written about probably 40% of it, and it's called The Case of the Consumerist Cosmos. And it's about how our entire concept of nature right now, the one that we're using to make all kinds of big decisions, is so radically wrong, it's hard to believe that anybody believes it. And, your concept of nature determines how you will make your decisions about what you're going to do next. So you have to have an accurate concept of nature. And the concept of nature I'm proposing in this book is very simply the result of all of the work that's been done in science since approximately 1650, when science began. Or 1600, if you want to trace it all the way back to Kepler and Galileo. We've had 400 years of research since then. And if you put it together in a big picture, the way I put things on a timeline in this puzzle piece of Islam and put them together in a story, all of a sudden things become very clear. So I've taken research from every field you can imagine and put it together in one big picture, and voila, there's a whole new view of nature that those of us who claim to be scientists are ignoring, even though it's what's in right there in all of our data. So I want to change that before I croak. I want to find the next big adventure. I really want to get to prime ministers and presidents and people like that. And I am, to a very small extent. I've been in a partnership for 3 years now with the 11th president of India, who is the only politician in India who he's been named one of the 2 most trusted men in India in a Reader's Digest India poll. Well, politicians are radically distrusted in India right now. They're all imagined to be corrupt, but not Dr. APJ Kalam. They call him the people's president, and he happens to be a rocket scientist. He happens to be the guy who designed the rockets that have taken over 70 satellites to space, and just a month ago launched India's first probe to Mars. Not to mention the rockets that took up the Chandrayaan, which is a satellite that looped the loop around the moon for 9 months with sophisticated measuring techniques and really confirmed that there's water on the poles of the moon, which is very important because water is oxygen for breathing and it's fuel for rocket ships. And so I'm working with him, and when I suddenly realized that Bashar Assad is not our real enemy in Syria, this is about 4 months ago, and that, in fact, he needs to stay in power because at least he provides stability and safety for most of the people of, this is not to say he's a good guy, but for most of the people of Syria, he's not a good guy. He's a very bad guy. But what we've seen in the Arab Spring is worse. We've seen utter chaos develop in one country after another, and we've seen rulers come to the surface who are just as monstrous as, almost as monstrous as Bashar Assad. And the real enemy I wanted to bring to the president's attention was Al-Qaeda, because Al-Qaeda was attempting to establish an emirate. An emirate, an emir, is a general. An emirate, we call, in English, they're translating it to state, again, because of Taqiyya, because they're trying to lie to us. No, that's not what they're calling it. They're calling it an emirate. An emirate is a military totalitarian dictatorship modeled on the military totalitarian dictatorships that Muhammad established. And they're intolerant, and they take killing for people on a regular basis for granted. It's just a natural part of the way you rule. They're monstrous. And I tried to get that message to the White House, and because the State Department, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, had thrown a forum in 2010 based on my book Global Brain, and they brought in people from the State Department, the Energy Department, DARPA, IBM, and MIT. So I knew people, thanks to this meeting, that were close to the White House decision-making apparatus and got this message to the White House. And they said, well, that's the way we're beginning to think. So I have no idea of whether I had an influence or did not have an influence, but I was able to get a lot closer than I was when I was 16 years old and knew nobody. But I want to get a lot closer to that. And I put together a program to do the ultimate World's Fair of our future in space, which I would ideally want to do in the United States, so that, nations that look up go up and nations that look down go down, and we are resolutely looking down. The rest of the world is not. China is not. Japan is not. And so in Malaysia, I put together this idea with a Malaysian partner for the ultimate World's Fair of Space, and I thought we would do it in India. And she recruited the Indians' ICC, which is their biggest chamber of commerce, and she recruited the ISRO, which is their NASA, to do our event. And then they cheapened our event. They turned it from what I had called Space Asia, this grand vision, to Space Biz 2008, which was nothing. There are tons of these little meetings in space, and they mean nothing. I'm trying to elevate your vision and give you a new big picture view. Well, so I had laid all of this out in elaborate documents, and about a year and a half ago, my partner in Malaysia said, I've quit my job, and I've gotten 2 other people to quit their jobs. We're going to work full time on your vision of space. And they've worked on it for the last year and a half. I got a Skype message about 6 weeks ago from my partner in Malaysia saying, Howard, we're meeting with 3 government ministers in Malaysia in 2 days. You have to give us a video explaining to them what we want to do and why we want to do it. And I gave them a fucking anthem on the future of humanity and how vision provides the infrastructure of fantasy in which we climb. Without the ladder, you can't climb. You can look at the stars, but you can't climb to them. With the ladder, you can climb. And if the ladder keeps growing, rung after rung after rung, you can climb to the stars in the long run. And that ladder is the infrastructure of fantasy. And that's why I want to present this vision of what can happen in space. Well, she scored with her 3 Malaysian government ministers. They said, yes, as long as Buzz Aldrin is involved, we're behind it. And so I got hold of Buzz. He was on vacation in the Seychelles, of all places, and he was supposed to be utterly inaccessible. And I got hold of Buzz, and Buzz said yes, because Buzz is one of the people who kidnapped me into the space community. He owes me. Well, not really, but at any rate. But we're friends, and we are on a common path. We're on a common adventure. So this is happening in Malaysia, and then I'm supposed to go to Japan to speak about harvesting solar power in space, which is something the Japanese deeply believe in. And one of the reasons I really want to go to this, because I get a lot of invitations that I don't accept, is because the 10 of the people from the Chinese space solar power program are going to be there. And I met those people in Chengdu, and I looked at 4 of them from the Chinese Academy of Space Technology. They have a budget to develop harvesting solar power in space of millions of dollars. We have no budget whatsoever in the United States, none. And I looked them in the eye and I said, we need a space race. We need you to race to get ahead of us as hard as you can so I can motivate, or we can motivate Americans to get involved in this. Well, they've continued to be involved, and 10 of them this time, not 4, 10, are going to be at this meeting, and I want to look them in the eye again. If that doesn't help me, they'll motivate America, and it's America I want to motivate, because America provides opportunities for freedom of speech, for freedom of belief, for the kind of adventures that are in How I Suddenly Started the 60s, for the kind of adventures that are in my life today, for the kind of adventures I want you to have, and Mark to have, and everybody who's watching this to have, that China will never provide. China has been busy just throughout the New York Times correspondent, because he was reporting on how the people at the top of the government are amassing billions of dollars for their family. They don't want that known, so they threw him out. They censor their own internet, so there are certain topics you can't discuss. They're publishing The Lucifer Principle, my first book, and the whole first chapter is set in the Chinese Cultural Revolution of the 1960s, which was a monstrous affair. To be published in China, they have to take out the entire first chapter because they're not allowed to talk about or know about the Chinese Cultural Revolution. Do you want to live in a country like that? I mean, I admire what they've achieved in the sense Deng Xiaoping in 1980, that's the last 30 years, tremendously. And I want to see it and taste it more than I did when I went to Chengdu for 3 days to talk about space solar power. But no, I want us to lead. We do monstrous things, the whole NSA, set of NSA revolutions, and the fact that Obama has been utterly blind to the fact that our basic freedoms, the ones guaranteed in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, are in danger of just disappearing overnight. But we have a right to complain about that. We have a right to orate about that. We have a right to make YouTube videos about that. The Chinese do not. Period. So I still want to see us leading. I don't want to even live in a state like France, where Brigitte Bardot, the sex bomb of the 1950s, is into animal rights. And she felt that the Muslim way of slaughtering animals was cruel. And she went on a crusade against it. And the Muslim communities are very organized. They're very top-down. They are very hierarchical and autocratic. And the autocrats, the Muslim autocrats, sued her. And they won. Want to live in a country like that, where you can't speak out against something that you think is very important? I may not agree with you, but I certainly want you to have the right to speak. I'm a Zionist. Today, when I woke up, C-SPAN was playing it was giving a speech that was given by a guy who's violently anti-Zionist, virulently anti-Zionist. It was very hard for me to take because a core belief of mine was being attacked. That's like being punched in the gut over and over again. Do I appreciate the fact that I can see that on C-SPAN? You bet. And I've been on C-SPAN, not talking about contentious issues like this, like Islam or anything like that. But we can discuss this kind of stuff in this society, and because we can discuss it, we can develop whole new frontiers, whole new landscapes that never existed before. When I got sick in 1988 and was too weak to talk or have another person in the room, eventually I learned my lesson about trying to sit up. I kept trying to do it over and over again, and that's why I didn't have a voice, because all my excess energy was going into trying to sit up, so I could pretend to still work. Well, I wasn't pretending, I really was working hard. Finally, I learned it takes energy to sit up. And if you lay in your bed and have two computers, because computers at that point had less processing power than a cell phone, if you set up two computers next to your bed and you get a great big foam rubber thing of the kind that they make these cushions out of, and you create it on the bottom, you shape it on the bottom of the keyboard so that from a perfectly flat position you can still see your keyboard and your monitor. I went out in 1988 into this landscape that had never existed before, called the Internet, called cyberspace. And I lost everything I had ever known as a human. I lost my future. I lost my ability to do everything that I had ever cherished. And I built a whole new personality in 3 years. It's me. It's genuinely me. It's even more genuinely me than the me you would see in normal life. Because in normal life, did I choose to be 5'7.5" tall, a virtual midget? Did I choose the face I have? None of us choose our bodies. I mean, yes, I do. I did 430 push-ups yesterday. So I obviously work on my body, but there's only so much you can do. You're born with a certain body type, a certain face, and it doesn't reflect who you really are. And if you go out on the internet, you no longer have the limitations of that face and body. So you can be who you really are in a way you could never be who you really are in physical life. So I went out as an explorer of this new landscape, the internet, and built a whole new personality there, and created and wrote 3 books while I was sick in bed, and founded 2 international scientific groups while I was sick in bed, thanks to this vast new landscape. Well, vast new landscapes of this kind come from free minds. They come from free minds exploring. They come from free minds exploring beyond the boundaries of normal society. And what is hippiedom all about? What was the 1960s all about? Seeing boundaries that have been invisible to you before and going beyond them. over and over and over again, because every time you go beyond them, you have an adventure. And risking your life, because you're going to the nth degree. You're going as far as you can into that strangeness. And you bring that strangeness back with you into other people, it eventually becomes ordinary. It adds to the landscape, the perceptual landscape of humanity. And we do that in free cultures in a way that a culture like the Chinese culture, where they're very viciously restrained, um, might never be able to do. We don't know. We'll have to wait and see. But I believe in basing a society on informed individuals being able to take their own path. I believe in that profoundly, and that's what the Constitution is based on. That the Bill of Rights enshrines the right to be an informed individual making up your own mind. It enshrines freedom of the press, which is at risk. Judith Miller was, I don't know how many months she spent in jail, and a reporter from Time magazine, I don't know how many months he spent in jail. That was a very bad sign. It was about 3 years ago, 4 years ago. Oh, I forgot. Judith wanted a copy of the Muhammad Code. Oh well. At any rate, um, but we're able to be vigilant. You know, what was the phrase? Vigilance is the price of eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. And we're able to be vigilant and protect these civil rights within our society. We're able to complain against the NSA. I'm able to go looking for a petition on whitehouse.gov saying free Bradley Manning and put my name on it, and then discover that there is no petition saying free Bradley Manning, and to write one. Mm-hmm. And to get 18,000 signatures, well, that's not enough to get the attention of the president, 18,000 signatures. But at least it's the right to try. And they don't have that in China. I want to see America's values expand. I want to see us get better and better at what we do. And we're only going to do it through the freedom of individual minds, the freedom of individual minds to a free press, the right to free speech and assembly, those are the two, and the right to privacy, to determine for ourselves what we'll let Google and Facebook know about us. But when the NSA takes over, no, we don't have that privacy anymore at all. Those are three basic principles on which this country is founded. And as Abraham Lincoln said in the Gettysburg Address, 7 years ago, our forefathers set forth upon this continent, and then he says basically a new experiment conceived of and dedicated to an idea. What he was saying is all the other nations on the face of this earth right now feel they have a right to nationhood based on being a tribe that settled in a certain place and having a collective tribal identity. That is not what holds us together in the United States. Again, this is the basic theme of the Gettysburg Address. What holds us together in the United States is our dedication to a concept, not to a genetic legacy. And that's fabulous. And we keep evolving that concept, but in order to evolve it, we need to evolve it around a common core like the nucleus of a cell. And that common core is the stuff that's in the Constitution. And I may disagree with people on the far right about what that Constitution says, but we have to keep those principles primal. And the NSA has no respect for it whatsoever. And Barack Obama, the most bitterly disappointing president in my time in the United States, in my lifetime, bitterly disappointing because he raised our hopes so high. And yet he doesn't, as a constitutional lawyer, he doesn't seem to understand the Constitution at all, or he would not allow the NSA to have every bit of information it could possibly find on all of us. But so the question was, what's next? And what's next is I'm looking for the next great adventure. Beyond, I want to do the case of the consumerist cosmos and show you, put out the timeline of this cosmos and the story of this cosmos the way that I gave you the story of Muhammad. And then I want to find the next great adventure, and I want to be able to be there with presidents when they're making decisions, because having a person whose view is totally whacked out, outside the bounds, it's not within the bounds of left, it's not within the bounds of right. In fact, I hate the rigidities of the left and the right. I hate the fact that they are in lockstep thinking. I won't, because all of us people are capable of thinking. They're all capable of thinking. And my job is to help them gain the freedom to think. So that's the stuff I want to do. I know it sounds vague and fuzzy,
No, I really look forward to seeing what's ahead, and we're very lucky to have you on the frontier of things.
And I'm so happy to be there. It's ridiculous.
Thank you so much, Howard.
Well, thanks, Ivy. And this is another episode of episode 2 of Beauty and the Brain. This is the brain. I'm the beauty. and it's another episode of Want to Know Why? Ask How? Howard the Humongous, coming to you from the future. It's your job and my job to make. Now Mark is looking for the off button. I don't have to look for the off button on this one. Somebody else has to do it. There it